Welcome, fellow traveller, to the Sleepless Voyager, where history becomes a gentle sea and time itself rocks like a ship in calm waters. Tonight we set sail into Captain Cook's calm Pacific voyages, where wooden decks creak softly, lanterns glow against the night, and horizons stretch endlessly beyond sight. Have you ever wondered what it might have felt like to leave all of Europe behind in 1768, with nothing ahead but the immeasurable Pacific and only the stars as your map? What did the ocean sound like before most of its islands had even been marked on paper? If these slow stories soothe you, you're welcome to like or subscribe, only if it feels right. And I'd love for you to leave a note of where and when you're listening. Every comment is like a lantern across this quiet sea, reminding me where our drifting crew gathers from. Now, settle in, breathe deeply, and step aboard. If you drift into dreams before we reach the farthest shores, that's perfectly fine. The ship will carry on for you. Imagine yourself standing at the wooden rail of the Endeavour, the ship chosen to bear Captain James Cook and his crew away from England in the late summer of 1768. The harbour is fading into twilight. Behind you, the coastline is already dissolving into a line of grey haze, while ahead the sea opens in a wide, endless breath. You feel the damp air cling to your clothes, a mingling of tar from the ropes, salt from the waves, and wood softened by spray. The sails, vast sheets of canvas, sway and fill with a heavy snap that echoes across the rigging, and the ship begins to settle into its own rhythm, an ancient lullaby of creaking timbers and sighing wind. Cook himself, calm and watchful, would have been somewhere near, perhaps standing on the quarterdeck with his journal tucked close, already thinking not of the shore that fell away behind him, but of the maps yet to be drawn, the stars yet to be measured, and the islands he had only heard of in sailors' tales. He was not merely a commander, he was a cartographer, a student of the heavens, and perhaps in his quietest thoughts, a dreamer who believed that the ocean's immensity could be transformed into lines of ink and compass points, if only one had the patience to sail it slowly enough. The crew, meanwhile, carried humbler thoughts. Some turned back toward the fading outline of England, imagining families waving handkerchiefs until the figures vanished from sight. Others looked forward, away from debts, away from taverns, away from old troubles better left behind. For them the ship was both prison and sanctuary, a place of cramped hammocks strung in damp darkness below, yet also a place of boundless freedom under the stars above. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the muttered jokes about hard biscuits and salted pork, the laughter that rose up even as they bent to heavy ropes, the murmured prayers at the change of watch. This voyage was more than exploration for curiosity's sake. The Royal Society had given Cook a mission to observe a rare celestial event, the transit of Venus across the Sun, which might, with careful notes and calculations, help reveal the scale of the solar system and sharpen the art of navigation. To you and me, it might sound like a tiny dot drifting across a golden disk, but to those who set sail, it was as if they had been asked to hold the universe in their hands for a moment, to watch the heavens mark time like the slow ticking of a divine clock. And yet, even with such grand purpose, daily life pressed forward in its ordinary way. Ship's biscuit, hard as stone, was chewed with determination or soaked in beer until it softened. Salted meat, dried peas, and cheese rounded out meals that could hardly be called a feast, though now and then the sailors might joke that the ship's rats seemed fattened enough to be part of the rations themselves. It was humour as dry as the biscuits, but it kept the days from growing too heavy. Above them, the sky spread like an open journal, waiting to be read. By day, the sun glittered across rolling water, and by night the stars rose in a sweep so vast it seemed another sea, one mapped by constellations instead of waves. The sailors trusted their captain to steer between the two, the ocean below and the heavens above, and in this balance they found a strange peace, a reminder that no matter how far they travelled, they were still part of something larger than themselves. Perhaps the greatest comfort of all was that the ocean, unlike men, was never in a hurry. Every mile was earned at the pace of the wind, with no faster clock than the pull of the tide. Cook's careful journals could measure longitude, his compass could trace bearings, but the sea itself taught patience. And there is a lesson in that for us tonight as well, that the most enduring voyages unfold slowly, like a rope uncoiling in steady hands, or like the rocking of a hammock where the body sinks deeper into rest. So here we begin, at the edge of known waters, with England dimming behind us and the Pacific waiting ahead, wide and unbroken. The sails are full, the deck is steady, and the story stretches like a horizon with no end. You are safe aboard this vessel of words, carried not by urgency, but by calm. And if your eyes grow heavy as we drift onward, let them close without worry. The voyage will continue, and the ocean will hold you. The coastline slips farther and farther into the distance, until the grey-green outline of England becomes no more than a faint shadow dissolving in the haze. What once was solid ground, fields and cottages and familiar roads, now blurs into a single memory, and in its place spreads only water. You might imagine standing at the ship's rail, feeling that curious mix of loss and anticipation as the land dwindles behind you. The sound of gulls, sharp and restless, grows fainter with every mile, replaced by the deeper and slower voice of the sea. The ship rocks forward into that voice, pulled steadily by the wind filling her sails, and it seems as though the vessel itself is eager to leave the old world behind. For the sailors, there is always a moment when leaving shore becomes real. At first, the harbour is noisy with dock workers, shouting voices, and the creak of wagons bringing final supplies. Then comes the ringing of bells, the crack of ropes being loosed, the shouts of officers echoing across the water. All of this feels busy, alive, loud with movement and command. But once the land falls away, there comes a hush, an almost holy silence broken only by the steady breath of the waves. It is in that silence that sailors truly understand they are no longer near home, but adrift on the world's greatest road, one paved not with stone but with restless water. Below deck, the men begin to arrange their hammocks, swaying gently with the rhythm of the ship. The smell here is different. Damp canvas, salt-soaked wood, the faint tang of smoke from cooking fires. It is not unpleasant, but it is thick, the sort of smell that settles into clothes and hair until it is impossible to separate man from ship. A boy of 15 might be carrying buckets of fresh water from casks, careful not to spill, while older sailors settle dice games in the dim light, already seeking small distractions to fill the endless hours ahead. Above, officers consult their charts and make careful notes, while Cook himself, ever disciplined, writes in his journal with steady hand. Ink scratches across parchment like the whisper of waves, each line already shaping the voyage into a story of record and remembrance. And yet, even amid discipline and routine, there are softer moments. The men gather near the forecastle in the evening, leaning against barrels or coiled ropes, and begin to sing. The songs are not elaborate, simple sea shanties, half jokes, half laments, but they carry across the deck and mingle with the sound of the sea. The harmonies are rough, yet in the vastness of open water, even rough harmonies become beautiful. Imagine yourself listening, the tune blending with the wind, the words fading into the endless night. It is not music for performance, not music to be remembered. It is music to pass time, to stitch together the hours like threads of rope holding the voyage in place. On deck, the last lights of the shore vanish. The sailors who linger at the rail glance back, but only once or twice. There is little comfort in staring too long at what can no longer be reached. Instead, their eyes turn forward into the wide ocean where the horizon is always ahead and never behind. For some, this is freedom, debts forgotten, mistakes left behind, the chance of a new story waiting on some distant shore. For others, it is burden, months of cramped quarters, uncertain storms, and the endless monotony of salted meat and biscuit. Both truths coexist, as surely as the sea itself holds both calm and storm within it. Cook, standing near the helm, sees neither burden nor escape but duty. His eyes, calm and measuring, trace the lines of the rigging, the tautness of ropes, the position of sails. He notes the speed of the ship, the direction of the wind, the angle of the sun. To him, the departure is not only symbolic but practical, a beginning to be marked, measured, and recorded. He knows the Pacific lies ahead, with mysteries uncharted, islands unnamed, and coasts unseen by European eyes. Yet he carries no illusion of romance. For him, each wave is part of a larger equation, each mile a piece of a map still incomplete. And still, one wonders if in some quiet corner of his mind he felt the thrill of it, the thought that they were leaving the world as they knew it, heading into one still shrouded in myth. As night comes, the sea takes on a silver sheen. The stars, freed from the haze of land, sharpen above in their countless thousands. Sailors on night watch pull their cloaks tighter, stamping their feet against the chill, while their eyes wander to constellations they have long trusted. Orion rises, his belt a familiar marker. The North Star steadies them, though soon it will fall lower, replaced by strange skies unknown in southern seas. The officers use instruments, sextants, compasses, sand glasses, but the sailors trust their instincts, the feel of wind on cheek, the pitch of waves against the hull. Between these two kinds of knowledge, measured science and lived experience, the ship finds its course, and you, standing quietly, would feel it too. The ship moves forward not in sudden leaps but in steady breaths. Each wave lifts her gently, then sets her down again, as though the ocean is reminding her, and you, that travel is a conversation, not a conquest. The stars above glimmer like lanterns, patient and eternal. The sea below rolls and murmurs like a companion too vast to be fully known. In this in-between, you might feel the hush of leaving shore behind, the way a dream begins when waking thoughts fade, not in a single moment but in a long quiet drift. So the voyage begins in earnest, with land behind and ocean ahead, with songs on the wind and star above, with duty, laughter and quiet longing bound together on a single deck of wood and rope. Tonight, as you let yourself sink into rest, perhaps you can imagine being part of that deck, one plank among many, rocked gently by the sea, carrying stories you have not yet heard to places you have not yet seen. And if your eyes grow heavy, let them close as the land disappears, for the voyage continues whether you watch or dream, and the sea will hold you steady either way. When a ship leaves shore, it does so with more than men and provisions aboard. It carries intentions, hopes, and the reasons that justify its long absence. For the Endeavour, setting out under Cook's command in 1768, that reason was written in the stars themselves. The Royal Society, which gathered the finest minds of Britain, had entrusted Cook and his companions with a task both humble and grand: to watch the heavens for a fleeting moment, to see the small black dot of the planet Venus pass across the glowing face of the sun. To you and me, that may sound like little more than a curiosity, a distant shadow upon a distant light, but in that era such an observation promised something transformative. If the transit of Venus could be measured from distant corners of the Earth, then astronomers believed they could calculate the distance between our planet and the Sun with new accuracy, and with it refine the very clockwork of the cosmos. Imagine standing on the deck and hearing this explained by one of the learned men on board, perhaps Joseph Banks or Charles Green, the astronomer chosen for the task. The sailors might nod, though many would not fully grasp the mathematics involved. For them, the heavens were guides for navigation, constellations like familiar companions above the mast. But here was a mission that joined sailor and scholar alike, for whether by sextant or by instinct, whether by compass or by memory, both seamen and scientists trusted that the stars could speak. And so, the Endeavour became not only a vessel of oaken rope, but also a floating observatory, a library at sea, a place where the vastness of the sky and the intimacy of human curiosity came together on rolling waves. The island chosen for this observation was Tahiti, a name that for most of the crew sounded like myth, a syllable carried on the whispers of traders and travellers who had glimpsed those far Pacific shores. To reach it, the Endeavour would have to cross oceans wider than the imagination of men who had never left Europe. Yet that very distance gave the mission its grandeur. The thought that a tiny speck on the sun's surface could link England to Tahiti, Europe to Polynesia, sailors to scholars, made the voyage feel less like leaving one world and more like entering a single, shared one. Joseph Banks, the young botanist who funded much of the scientific effort himself, embodied this spirit of connection. With notebooks ready and a restless curiosity, he prepared not only to witness the heavens but to catalogue the earth, plants never before seen by European eyes, birds of strange plumage, shells and insects that shimmered with colours unknown in England's meadows. To him, the voyage was as much about discovering the quiet miracles of nature as it was about tracing the orbits of planets. He brought artists and assistants, eager to turn the Endeavour into a floating garden of specimens, where every island might yield treasures pressed between pages or painted in watercolours. The sailors sometimes joked about his enthusiasm, laughing at the sight of him crouched over leaves or chasing butterflies across a sandy beach. But even they felt a kind of pride knowing their ship carried not just men of war but men of wonder. Cook himself approached the mission with a different temperament. Where Banks saw beauty, Cook saw precision. Where Banks marvelled, Cook measured. His journals were filled with neat lines, careful bearings, and sketches of coasts drawn with a hand steady as the tide. Yet beneath that discipline was something deeper, a conviction that to chart the world was to serve not only king and country, but knowledge itself. He was not a man of flamboyance, but of quiet duty, and it was this steadiness that made him suited to such a voyage. The Pacific was vast, its waters stretching farther than any Englishman had yet crossed, but Cook believed that with patience and care each mile could be made known. As the ship pressed farther into the Atlantic on its way southward, the men began to sense the scale of their journey. The stars above seemed brighter now, freed from the haze of cities, and Green, the astronomer, would often be seen gazing upward with instruments in hand, measuring angles, jotting figures, lost in calculations, while sailors teased him with playful remarks about chasing ghosts among the stars. Yet in quieter moments, even the roughest seaman would glance upward, wondering what it meant that their lives were bound up in so delicate a task. Could a single dark speck on the sun really matter so much? Could the universe itself be measured by eyes peering through smoked glass on a faraway beach? It is in questions like these that the beauty of the voyage reveals itself. For though the sailors might grumble about rations or laugh at the botanists, though Cook himself might be stern and unyielding in command, all of them together were part of something larger than themselves. They carried not only sails and ropes, not only salted pork and biscuit, but the weight of curiosity, the human hunger to know where we are in the immensity of things. And if you, dear listener, stand with them for a moment on that deck, you might feel it too. The sense that the sea is not only water, but a bridge, that the sky is not only light, but a book waiting to be read, that each of us, in our own way, is always searching for the small clues that tell us how far we've come and how much farther we might go. So the Endeavour sailed on, carrying men of discipline and men of wonder, carrying instruments polished in London and songs hummed in rough voices, carrying maps half drawn and plants not yet seen. Its purpose lay ahead in a speck of shadow on the sun, but along the way It would gather countless other stories of islands, of peoples, of storms, of stars, and as the sails filled and the horizon stretched, the voyage became more than a mission. It became a meditation on the vastness of the world and the patience required to cross it. Tonight, as you breathe slowly, you too may let that patience seep into your rest. Like the Endeavour, you need not hurry. The horizon will come to you in time, steady as the tide, faithful as the stars. If the grand purpose of a voyage is written in the stars, then the daily experience of it is written in the deck beneath one's feet, in the ropes that must be hauled, in the buckets of water that must be carried, and in the endless rituals of keeping a ship alive upon the sea. For the men of the Endeavour, life was not a single sweep of adventure, but a rhythm of tasks repeated day after day, until routine itself became the steady heartbeat of the voyage. Imagine yourself among them, waking to the call of the boatswain's whistle, the shrill note slicing through the dimness below deck, where hammocks swayed in the gloom like rows of cocoons. The air down there was thick, heavy with the smell of salt, sweat and damp cloth, and as men swung their legs to the floor, the boards creaked with the weight of many bodies rising almost at once. On deck, the morning began with the cleansing of the ship. Swabs were dipped into buckets, and the men scrubbed the planks with stiff brushes until water ran across the boards in thin streams. It was not glamorous work, but it was necessary. A clean deck meant fewer diseases, fewer accidents, and a sense of order that helped hold the crew together. The sound of brushes rasping across wood mingled with the slap of waves against the hull, and together they made a rhythm almost hypnotic in its regularity. While some men scrubbed, others climbed into the rigging, loosening or tightening sails, their bodies small silhouettes against the pale morning sky. The rope smelled of tar, and the canvas creaked and sighed as it shifted in the wind. Meals broke the labour into intervals, though they were hardly feasts. The ship's biscuit, hard as stone and often freckled with small insects, was a staple that sailors had learned to soften in beer or water before attempting to chew. Salted pork or beef provided the main portion, its taste so briny that men joked it carried the entire ocean inside it. Sometimes peas or dried beans appeared, boiled until they lost shape, and occasionally there was cheese, though by long weeks at sea it grew sharp and sour. Still, the men found ways to laugh about their fare. One popular jest was that the ship had more life crawling in the bread than in the sea around them, and another was that the cheese must have been cut from the hull itself, given how hard it was to bite. These dry jokes were repeated so often that they became part of the diet too, something to chew on when the meal itself offered little joy. After eating, the men returned to their tasks. Ropes needed splicing, sails needed patching, barrels needed shifting, and tools needed sharpening. The ship was a world unto itself, a floating town in miniature, and every man had his craft. The carpenters hammered, the sailmakers stitched, the cooks tended their kettles, and the gunners checked their powder and shot. Even when there was no immediate danger, the discipline of being prepared was part of the rhythm. For the sea was an unpredictable master, and to be ready was to survive. And yet, amid the duties, there were moments of idleness, stretches of calm when the horizon stretched blank and blue in every direction, and the men found themselves with time to fill. Some played at dice, the clatter of bone cubes against wood mingling with the murmur of conversation. Others whittled small figures out of scraps of wood, their knives flashing in the sunlight. A few even kept pets, cats to chase the rats, or small birds caught in nets along the way, creatures that provided both amusement and companionship. At night, the ship settled into quieter rhythms. Lanterns swung gently from hooks, their glow painting the deck in pools of gold. The sea, darker now, seemed to merge with the sky until the ship floated between two infinities. On such nights, the watchman paced slowly, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of land or sail. The rest of the crew, wrapped in blankets or hammocks, drifted towards sleep with the creak of timbers and the whisper of waves as their lullaby. Sometimes, from the darkness below, a low voice began a song, and others joined in, weaving rough harmonies that rose softly through the beams. These songs were often simple, verses about home, about love, about the sea itself, but they carried a warmth that turned the ship, for a little while, into a family gathered around an invisible hearth. Cook encouraged discipline but understood the need for morale. He made sure the men were kept busy, but he also allowed space for these small joys. In his journals, he wrote not only of distances and bearings, but also of the condition of the crew, the health of the men, the fairness of rations. He knew that the success of the voyage depended as much on spirits as on science. And so, he walked the deck with calm authority, stern when needed but not unkind, reminding the men through his presence that order could be steady without being cruel. When storms came, and they always did, the routines became more frantic. Men scrambled to reef sails, ropes groaned under the strain, and the sea rose against the hull with a voice like thunder. But when the storm passed, the crew returned to their routines, swabbing, eating, repairing, and joking as if nothing had happened. This resilience, this ability to fold danger back into the rhythm of daily life, was perhaps the truest mark of a sailor. Life aboard the Endeavour was not one of constant drama, but of constant maintenance, a balance between duty and endurance, between humour and hardship. For you, listening tonight, there is comfort in this ordinariness. The voyage may have carried men to uncharted islands and celestial observations, but for most of their days they lived as we all do, working, eating, resting, finding small joys amid necessary labours. The great discoveries lay ahead, but the heartbeat of the ship was in these routines. So as you breathe in and out, perhaps you can feel that rhythm too. The rasp of brushes on wood, the crack of biscuit, the murmur of voices, the creak of hammocks, all blending into the slow music of life at sea. It is steady, patient and unhurried, just as your own body is steady in rest, your breath patient, your thoughts unhurried. The ship carries on, and so do you, safe in the quiet sea of sleep. When the sun sinks and the horizon darkens into a long silver line, the ship does not rest. The sea never sleeps, and so neither can those who ride upon it. The men of the Endeavour took turns through the long hours of darkness, each assigned to what sailors called a watch. The watch was not only a duty but a rhythm, dividing the night into measured segments, a way of ensuring that the vessel remained awake even as many of its crew slept in hammocks below. Imagine standing there in the cool night air, the world hushed except for the steady slap of waves against the hull, and the low creak of rope shifting as the sails responded to the faintest change of the wind. The night watch was a world apart from the day. Gone were the shouts of officers, the hammering of carpenters, and the endless bustle of swabbing and hauling. In their place came silence, heavy and almost sacred, broken only by the footsteps of men pacing the deck, their boots thudding softly on the planks. A lantern or two swung from its hook, casting circles of golden light that wavered with the ship's motion, but beyond that glow stretched an ocean of darkness. The stars overhead burned with an intensity unfamiliar to those who had lived under the smoke and haze of cities. Out here, with no land for hundreds of miles, the sky became a second sea, and the ship floated between them, suspended in infinity. Navigation by night was a skill as much felt as measured. The officers brought out sextants, polished instruments of brass that caught what little light there was, and measured the angle of stars above the horizon. To explain it simply, one might say it was like holding a cup against the sky, tilting it until the rim touched both the star and the edge of the sea, and then noting how full the cup had become. To the sailors who did not trouble themselves with calculations, it was enough to trust that these gleaming pinpricks above somehow told them where they were and where they were going. To you, listening now, it may feel like a kind of poetry, that the same stars that guided Cook and his men still hang above us, steady and patient, inviting not only measurements, but dreams. There were nights when the sea was calm and the stars reflected on its surface until it was impossible to say where sky ended and ocean began. Sailors standing at the rail felt as though they were drifting through the heart of the heavens themselves, the ship a fragile thread stitching together two vast mirrors. At such moments, voices fell to whispers, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the illusion. One might hum a tune softly, or murmur a prayer, or simply breathe and feel the immensity press gently around them. These were not moments of fear, but of awe, the kind of awe that seeps into the bones and lingers there long after the night has passed. Of course, not every night was calm. There were times when clouds swept in, blotting out the sky, and rain came in thin sheets that blurred both sea and stars. On such nights, the lanterns seemed feeble, their glow swallowed almost instantly by the dark. The men wrapped cloaks tight against their shoulders, heads bowed, eyes straining against the spray. Yet even then the watch was held. The pacing continued, the ship kept alive by the steady movement of men who knew that vigilance was as essential as food or water. And when at last the clouds tore apart and the stars returned, the relief was palpable, as though old friends had come back to reassure them that the world was still turning, the heavens still watching. Cook, ever the observer, often joined the watch himself, not content to leave matters entirely to his officers. He would stand at the rail, journal in hand, noting the direction of wind, the roll of the swell, the position of constellations. His handwriting remained steady even when the ship lurched, a reflection of his own inner steadiness. To him, the stars were not only guides but guarantees, fixed points in a world otherwise filled with shifting waves and uncertain shores. In his journals he described them with precision, yet one can imagine that he too must have felt the quiet wonder of those nights, the same wonder you might feel as you picture yourself looking upward now, tracing lines between stars, letting them tell you that you're both very small and part of something unimaginably large. The sailors found their own meanings in the sky. Some told stories of sea monsters hidden in constellations, creatures whose shapes could be seen if one squinted long enough. Others pointed out patterns that reminded them of home, a belt of stars like a string of beads a mother once wore, or a cluster that resembled the lanterns of a familiar street. A few simply looked upward and thought of nothing at all, letting their minds empty into the vastness, carried along by the ship's slow rocking. And in this way, the night watch was as much a meditation as a duty. Each man, whether calculating angles with instruments or leaning silently at the rail, was drawn into a state of quiet presence, connected to sea and sky in equal measure. Perhaps the most comforting part of the night watch was the sense of continuity. As you stood your turn, you knew that before you another had walked this deck and after you another would come. The ship never truly slept because the watch never ceased. It was a chain of care, each link connected by footsteps on the planks, each link ensuring that the vessel moved forward safely through the dark. In the same way, your own breathing tonight may feel like a watch, steady and unbroken, one breath following another, keeping you safe as you drift. So the hours passed, not in haste but in quiet unfolding. The stars arched overhead, the waves murmured below, the lanterns swayed in their gentle arcs, and the ship continued forward, unseen but certain of its course. And as you imagine yourself there, wrapped in the cool night air, listening to the rhythm of sea and sky, perhaps you too feel the hush of the watch, the peace of knowing that though the night is vast, you are carried through it with care, guided by stars as old as time, steady as the beating of your own heart. After months of open water, the sea stretching endlessly in every direction, the first glimpse of land came like a dream taking shape from mist. The sailors who had grown used to nothing but horizon leaned forward at the rail, pointing, whispering, some hardly believing their eyes. At first it was no more than a smudge against the sky, darker than cloud, softer than shadow, but as the hours passed it sharpened into mountains rising steeply from the sea, their slopes cloaked in a green so vivid it seemed to glow against the blue of ocean and sky. The men breathed in air that smelled suddenly different, tinged with sweetness, carrying hints of flowers and fruit drifting out across the waves. After so long with only salt and wood and smoke, the scent itself felt like a feast. Tahiti lay before them, an island of lagoons and reefs, of palms bending in the wind, of canoes gliding across the surf. The water near shore was calm and shallow, changing colour from deep sapphire to bright turquoise, until it was so clear that fish could be seen darting just beneath the surface, flashes of silver and yellow flickering like coins in a fountain. The sound of surf echoed steadily, breaking on the coral reef that ringed the island, while from within that ring came other sounds, fainter at first and then stronger as the ship drew nearer. Drums in slow rhythm, voices lifted in song, a chorus carried across the water, as though the island itself was calling a welcome. For Cook and his companions, this was not only the arrival at a beautiful place, but the arrival at a destiny. It was June of 1769, the moment for which the voyage had been launched, to set up their instruments on this Pacific shore and watch the planet Venus pass across the face of the sun. But before charts and telescopes could be arranged, there was the meeting of people, the first exchanges of greeting, gesture and curiosity. Canoes, slim and graceful, came skimming across the lagoon, paddled by men whose movements were fluid and powerful, each stroke of their paddle slicing the water without a splash. They circled the Endeavour, gazing upward at the towering masts and sails with wonder equal to that of the sailors looking down at them. Garlands of flowers were lifted high, baskets of fruit held aloft, gestures of welcome offered with open hands and open hearts. Joseph Banks, ever eager, leaned over the side, his eyes wide as he took in the richness of the land and the generosity of its people. He wrote in his journal of breadfruit, coconuts, bananas, and fish, food so abundant that they seemed to spill from every hand. A banquet laid not on a table but across an entire island. The sailors, who had grown weary of biscuit and salted pork, could hardly believe their fortune. They bit into fruit so juicy it dripped down their chins, laughed as they cracked coconuts against the deck, and savoured the sweetness as though it were the very taste of paradise. Some joked that they had found a place where heaven and earth overlapped, where even the air seemed to feed the body. Cook, though cautious, accepted the welcome with measured grace. He ordered gifts exchanged, beads, cloth, iron nails, and trinkets from the ship's stores. The islanders examined these with interest, their fingers tracing the smoothness of metal, the softness of fabric. In return, they offered more food, more flowers, even pigs and chickens, until the decks of the Endeavour looked less like a warship and more like a market filled with colour and scent. Drums continued to throb from the shore, voices rising and falling, while dancers moved in unison along the beach, their steps echoing the rhythms of tide and song. To the sailors it was both spectacle and mystery, a world utterly different from the one they had left, yet welcoming them as though they were expected guests. The evenings in Tahiti were soft and golden, the sun sinking behind the mountains and casting long shadows across the lagoon. Fires flickered along the shore, their smoke mingling with the scent of roasting breadfruit. The crew, invited ashore, found themselves garlanded with flowers, their hair crowned with leaves, their hands filled with food. They listened to songs in a language they did not yet understand, but the tones needed no translation. They were songs of welcome, of kinship, of joy at the meeting of strangers who were strangers no longer. The sailors, awkward at first, soon laughed with their hosts, some joining in the dancing, others sitting quietly, their faces softened by the firelight, their hearts perhaps softened too. Banks and his artists sketched by lamplight, eager to capture every detail. The curve of the canoes, the plaiting of mats, the shape of huts framed in palm trunks, the patterns painted on bark cloth. For him, Tahiti was not only a place but a revelation, a chapter of the world's great book opening before him. Cook, meanwhile, thought of the transit of Venus, the reason they had come, and he planned carefully where to build an observatory, where to set their telescopes, how to ensure that this moment in the heavens would not be lost. And yet, even he must have felt the beauty of those evenings, the strange peace that comes when an ocean voyage ends not in storm or hostility, but in the warmth of welcome. Imagine yourself there, standing on the beach as the sky deepens to violet, the surf whispering just beyond the reef, the air heavy with the perfume of flowers and smoke. You feel the garland around your neck, petals cool against your skin, the taste of fruit lingering sweetly on your tongue. Voices rise around you, some familiar, some strange, but all mingled into harmony. The drums beat like a second heart, steady and reassuring, and above the stars begin to appear one by one, the same stars that brought the Endeavour here, the same stars that will soon carry it onward again. In that moment, you understand why the sailors laughed, why Banks sketched with such urgency, why even Cook, precise and disciplined, allowed himself to stand still for a while. It was because Tahiti was not simply a point on a map, but a place where the ocean itself seemed to pause, where time slowed to the rhythm of drums and surf, and where strangers became companions in the shared light of fire and sky. So the Endeavour rested for a time in this lagoon of warmth and song, her sails furled, her decks alive with flowers and fruit, her crew fed not only with food but with wonder. The Pacific, vast and unpredictable, had revealed its first gift, and the men who had crossed so many empty miles now felt that the world was larger and kinder than they had imagined. And as you drift tonight into your own rest, you may carry that same thought, that even after long stretches of emptiness, there comes a shore, a welcome, a place where the air is sweet and the night is filled with song. The island settled into a hush on the morning chosen for the great observation, as though even the land and sea understood the significance of the moment. The Endeavour had anchored in the calm of Matavai Bay, and upon the shore a small fort and observatory had been built, its wooden posts lashed together, its canvas stretched against the island's breezes. Here, in June of 1769, Cook and his companions prepared to watch the heavens, to record with steady hands and sharpened eyes a sight that came only once in a century. They had travelled thousands of miles, endured storms and long weeks of monotony, for this brief alignment of planet and star. Imagine the air that morning, heavy with the scent of flowers from nearby groves, mingled with the salt of the lagoon. Palm fronds swayed above the beach, their rustling joining the distant murmur of surf upon the reef. Polynesian voices could be heard singing softly in the distance, though nearer to the observatory there was quiet, a quiet charged with expectation. Cook stood with his officers while the astronomer Charles Green arranged his instruments, the brass gleaming in the light of the early sun. Beside them, Joseph Banks crouched with notebook ready, not to measure stars but to capture the atmosphere, the human faces, the sense of being present at a union of earth and sky. When the moment came, it was not with thunder or fanfare but with subtlety, as though the universe preferred to whisper rather than shout. Upon the disk of the sun, seen through smoked glass to protect the eye, a tiny black dot appeared, no larger than the head of a pin. It was Venus, gliding slowly across the golden surface, its passage silent, its meaning immense. To those who watched, it felt almost unreal. How could such a small shadow reveal the distance between worlds, the scale of the solar system, the true place of the Earth among the stars. And yet, through careful measurement, it would. The heavens, for a few precious hours, had become a vast clock, and Cook's men were its keepers. The sailors, less concerned with the mathematics, gathered nearby, craning their necks when invited to peer through the glass. Some gasped softly, some laughed with surprise, others simply shook their heads, unable to reconcile the idea that this small speck held such weight. They had been told of the importance, that from sites across the globe, Tahiti, India, North America, astronomers would be watching together, their notes later combined to calculate the scale of the cosmos. For the sailors, it was enough to feel part of something larger, to sense that their long voyage was stitched into a wider tapestry, that the ocean had carried them not just to islands but into the heart of a universal question. Joseph Banks, ever eager to weave poetry from science, described the stillness of that morning, how even the birds seemed to quiet as the planet passed. He sketched not only the instruments but the faces of those who watched, their brows furrowed in concentration, their lips pressed in silent awe. He would later write that no fruit, no flower, no insect could rival the beauty of that tiny dot moving across the sun, because in it lay the promise of knowledge, the union of man's curiosity with the order of the heavens. Cook himself remained practical, noting times, recording positions, ensuring accuracy. His handwriting was neat, precise, unshaken by excitement. Yet one can imagine as he looked up from his figures that he felt the same quiet wonder as his companions. He was a man of discipline, yes, but also of vision, and here the two were joined. The transit of Venus was not simply an astronomical event. It was proof that voyages such as his had meaning beyond trade or conquest, that they touched upon the very fabric of the universe. As the hours passed, the dot crept slowly across the sun's face, until at last it slipped away, vanishing into the brilliance of light. The men exhaled as though waking from a spell. Instruments were folded, notebooks closed, and the ordinary sounds of the island returned. The rustle of palm leaves, the chatter of birds, the laughter of Tahitian children playing at the water's edge. For a brief time, heaven and earth had met, and now life continued as before, yet changed in ways that would ripple outward through maps, charts, and minds across the world. The Tahitians, who had watched the strangers with their glass and brass, their writing and measuring, must have wondered at the intensity with which these pale visitors studied the sky. To them, the stars were guides and stories, companions that had long directed canoes across vast seas without paper or ink. They did not need Venus crossing the sun to tell them where they were or how far they might go. And yet, in their own way, they shared in the wonder, smiling as the men cheered softly, offering fruit and flowers to mark the conclusion of this strange ritual of light. Imagine yourself seated on that shore, the sand warm beneath you, the lagoon glittering, the fort's canvas snapping gently in the breeze. You hold the smoked glass to your eye, see the sun dim to a safe glow, and there, a small dot making its way across the golden circle. You feel the stillness around you, the world holding its breath, the sky opening its secrets just long enough to be glimpsed. And as you lower the glass, blinking against the bright light, you know you have seen something that will outlast you. Something that will be remembered not only in numbers, but in the quiet awe of all who were there. That evening, as firelight flickered on the beach and drums echoed once more, the men of the Endeavour rested with satisfaction. Their duty had been fulfilled, their mission accomplished. Yet beyond duty lay something deeper, the sense of having touched the infinite, of having seen with mortal eyes the dance of planets and stars. They ate their fruit, shared laughter with their hosts, and beneath the returning constellations, they felt themselves part of a universe both vast and intimate. For you, tonight, the transit of Venus can be a metaphor of your own journey into sleep. Just as that small dot moves slowly across the brilliance of the sun, your thoughts drift slowly across the brilliance of wakefulness until they vanish quietly, slipping away into the glow of dreams. The sky above still watches, the stars still guide, and you are safe within the rhythm of the cosmos, carried forward like the Endeavour on its calm Pacific tide. Not long after the observation of the transit of Venus, when the excitement of science had begun to fade back into the ordinary rhythms of ship and shore, another moment of quiet destiny arrived. It did not appear in the form of stars crossing the sun, nor in the careful turning of brass instruments, but in the meeting of a man whose presence would change the voyage in ways as significant as any celestial measurement. His name was Tupaia, and he was a priest, an artist, a navigator, and a man whose mind held the map of the Pacific in memory and tradition. Where Cook carried charts and compasses, Tupaia carried stories, songs, and the invisible lines of knowledge passed down by generations of Polynesians who had sailed these waters long before the Endeavour cut her path across the sea. Banks was among the first to take notice of him. Ever curious about the people of the island, he was struck by Tupaia's dignity, his command of language, and his understanding of the world beyond Tahiti's shores. The two spoke through gestures at first, then words slowly pieced together, until Banks realised that here was not merely a local guide, but a man who seemed to hold in his mind a map stretching across thousands of miles. Tupaia could name islands Cook had never heard of, pointing in directions where no European map yet marked land, and describing voyages undertaken by his ancestors in canoes that skimmed the ocean like swift birds. Cook, cautious but intrigued, listened as Tupaia explained how Polynesians read the sea and sky. Where Europeans measured the angle of a sextant, Polynesians watched the rising and setting of stars against the horizon, memorizing their positions as pathways across the heavens. Where Cook noted latitude and longitude, Tupaia remembered the rhythm of swells, the direction of prevailing winds, the flight of birds, and the patterns of clouds that gathered over islands beyond sight. For him, the ocean was not empty but full of signs, each wave a sentence, each constellation a direction, each breeze a whisper of land nearby. The sailors, who had grown used to relying on compasses and charts, looked at him with amazement. When Tupaia, standing on the deck, pointed to the horizon and named an island far beyond their vision, they exchanged glances, half sceptical, half awed. Some joked lightly, suggesting he must have the eyes of a hawk or the nose of a hound to sense such things, but their laughter carried a note of respect. They began to realise that in this vast Pacific, where European maps left wide blank spaces, Tupaia's knowledge was as valuable as any instrument. Banks urged Cook to bring Tupaia aboard, and after some discussion, Cook agreed. It was not a decision made lightly. Space on the Endeavour was already crowded, and every mouth to feed mattered. Yet the advantages were clear, and perhaps too Cook sensed that this man represented a bridge between worlds, a living chart who could guide not only the ship, but also the understanding between peoples. And so Tupaia joined the voyage, stepping aboard with a quiet grace, his robes flowing, his eyes calm but observant, as though he already understood the weight of his new role. Life on the Endeavour must have been strange for him. The hammocks swaying in the dim lower deck, the salted meat and biscuit, the constant creak of timbers, all of this was far from the warmth of Tahitian hearths and the freshness of island food. Yet he adapted, moving easily among the crew, sketching drawings of the places they visited, speaking with Cook and Banks about customs, rituals, and the meanings woven into Polynesian life. In time, he became interpreter as well as navigator, his voice carrying across moments when mistrust might have grown between sailors and islanders. A single word from Tupaia, calm and certain, could ease a tense meeting on a beach, turning suspicion into welcome, silence into song. At night, under the open sky, he he sometimes taught the sailors to see the stars as he did. Imagine yourself among them, lying on the deck, listening as he pointed upward, naming stars not in Latin or English but in the soft syllables of Polynesian tongues. He traced lines invisible to European eyes, paths that stitched one constellation to another, forming not figures of myth, but highways across the heavens. To hear him speak was to realise that the sky was not a picture, but a map, that the ocean was not a void, but a place threaded with routes as precise as any road on land. Some sailors whispered afterward that it felt like listening to a poem too vast to be written down, a poem that was always above them, waiting to be read. Cook, though less inclined to poetry, respected Tupaia's skill. In his journals, he wrote of the man's ability to chart islands scattered across the sea, of his memory that seemed as reliable as any instrument. And though Cook relied on his own charts and calculations, one can imagine that he too felt a certain awe, watching Tupaia stand at the rail, gazing into the horizon as if reading words invisible to others. It was a reminder that knowledge comes in many forms, that the world is too wide to be measured by a single tradition. Humour too found its place in this relationship. The sailors, impressed yet bewildered, sometimes teased that Tupaia must have a secret spyglass hidden in his robes, or that he had struck a bargain with the stars themselves. Tupaia, amused, answered with a smile or a quick remark that left them laughing. In those moments, the distance between European and Polynesian, between sextant and memory, between map and song seemed to shrink, replaced by the shared humanity of laughter under the same sky. For you, listening tonight, there is comfort in this thought, that the ocean of life can be navigated in many ways. Some rely on instruments and numbers, others on instinct and memory, others still on the stories handed down through generations. Yet all find their course, and all arrive in time at the shores meant for them. As the Endeavour sailed on with Tupaia now among her company, she carried not only the science of Europe but the poetry of Polynesia, not only the charts of Cook, but the memory maps of a navigator whose mind held the Pacific as clearly as a captain holds a compass. So the voyage deepened, its horizon widening, its story enriched by the joining of the worlds. The sea stretched on, as vast as ever, but now the men aboard knew they carried with them not only sails and ropes, but a man whose gaze could pierce beyond the horizon, who could see islands hidden from their eyes, and who reminded them that the ocean, for all its immensity, was already known, already sung, already lived in ways they were only beginning to understand. Among the many figures aboard the Endeavour, none brought quite the same energy of restless curiosity as Joseph Banks. He was young, wealthy and passionate, a man who could have stayed in the gardens of England with ease and comfort, but who instead chose to endure cramped hammocks, salted rations, and long uncertain weeks upon the sea, all for the chance to see what flowers might bloom beyond the edges of known maps. While Cook carried sextants and compasses, Banks carried notebooks, presses, and an almost childlike eagerness to kneel in the dirt and gather petals, leaves and seeds, as though they were treasures more valuable than gold. From the moment the Endeavour anchored in the Pacific, Banks was in constant motion. Imagine him stepping ashore in Tahiti, his boots sinking into warm sand, his eyes immediately scanning the trees for unfamiliar leaves. He carried with him assistants and artists, men trained to sketch and paint quickly, before colours faded or insects escaped. At his side, Daniel Solander, a Swedish naturalist and student of Carl Linnaeus, helped name and classify the discoveries, ensuring that each plant would be not only admired but also catalogued into the great system of scientific order. Together they formed a kind of floating academy, a garden on water, with the Endeavour as their mobile greenhouse and library. The sailors watched with amusement as Banks and his team collected specimens by the hundreds. Some laughed at the sight of their shipmates returning with arms full of flowers instead of food, or chasing butterflies with nets while others hauled ropes and barrels. Yet even the roughest sailor softened when Banks shared his excitement, pointing out the brilliance of a feather or the intricacy of a blossom. His enthusiasm was contagious, and soon even men who had never cared for plants began to notice the colours along the shoreline, remarking on the size of leaves or the strange shapes of seed pods. It was as though Banks had opened their eyes to a second world layered over the first, a world of quiet marvels hidden in plain sight. He took special care in preserving each find. Leaves were pressed between sheets of paper, flowers carefully laid flat so that their forms might be remembered long after the petals themselves had withered. Seeds were stored in small packets, labelled with neat handwriting, while sketches were made to capture the colours that paper could not hold. At night, when the sailors sang or played dice, Banks could often be found hunched over his work by lantern light, his hands stained with sap, his clothes streaked with pollen, his face glowing with satisfaction. He was, in his own way, as dedicated to precision as Cook, though his maps were drawn not with coastlines and soundings, but with stems and petals. Over the course of the voyage, Banks and his companions would collect more than 30,000 specimens, a number so vast it seemed almost impossible. Each one represented a fragment of the Pacific world, carried back across the sea to enrich the gardens and libraries of Europe. For Banks, these were not trophies, but gifts, each plant a voice whispering of the places where it grew, of the soil and climate that had shaped it, of the people who had long lived among it. He asked questions of the Tahitians about which plants were eaten, which were used for medicine, which held meaning in ritual or story. In this way, his curiosity became not just scientific but cultural, bridging the distance between collector and community. Imagine walking with him through a grove of breadfruit trees, their broad leaves catching the light like sheets of green glass. He would explain with his quick eagerness how the fruit could be roasted to feed a family, how the bark could be used for cloth, how the tree itself was woven into the fabric of island life. Or picture him crouching by a stream where orchids clung to rocks, their blossoms trembling with the touch of water. His voice would soften as he described their delicate symmetry, comparing them to jewels hidden in the forest, waiting only for an attentive eye. For Banks, every plant was a story, and the Pacific was a library filled with pages rustling in the wind. The sailors, though less enchanted by botany, found joy in the practical fruits of his collections. Fresh greens meant relief from scurvy, the dreaded disease of long voyages, and Banks took pride in encouraging the crew to eat the local produce. He might have smiled quietly as a grumbling sailor bit into a strange fruit for the first time, only to find it sweet and refreshing after weeks of salted pork. In this way, his work touched not only the pages of his notebooks, but also the health and spirit of the men around him. Cook respected Banks, though at times their temperaments contrasted. Cook was cautious, disciplined, and sparing with words, while Banks overflowed with energy, conversation, and enthusiasm. Yet each understood the other's importance. Cook charting the seas, Banks charting the life upon its islands, both together weaving a tapestry of discovery that was as much about understanding as it was about possession. At night, when the ship rocked gently at anchor, Banks often sat on deck with his specimen spread around him, the scent of crushed leaves mingling with the smell of tar and salt. He looked up at the stars and felt that the Pacific was a blooming book, each constellation above like a heading, each island visited like a chapter, each plant pressed and labelled like a line of verse. And as he turned the pages of this book, he believed he was reading not only the story of nature but also the story of humanity's place within it. For you, listening now, there is a calmness in this vision. To imagine the Pacific as a blooming book is to realise that even in the vastness of ocean, even in the immensity of sky, there are always details small and delicate that matter. A flower pressed between pages, a seed tucked into a packet, a sketch in a notebook. All are reminders that wonder lives not only in horizons and storms, but also in petals and stems. As you breathe slowly, you too can picture yourself leafing through that book, each breath turning a page, each page a step deeper into rest. Though the voyage carried with it the weight of science and discovery, for most of the men aboard the Endeavour life unfolded in simpler, earthier rhythms, a mixture of labour, idleness, and the kind of humour that grows in close quarters where men must share every waking hour. Their routines were as steady as the tides, but it was within those routines that they carved out the small moments of laughter and companionship that kept spirits alive through the long weeks at sea. Morning began, as it always did, with the call of the boatswain's whistle and the scraping of brushes on the deck. Yet once the planks were clean and the sails adjusted, the men found ways to fill the hours that stretched endlessly across the horizon. Dice rattled against overturned barrels, the clatter rising above the murmur of conversation, while coins, buttons, or even scraps of tobacco served as wagers. The sailors laughed at their luck, cursed at their losses, and teased each other mercilessly, their voices carrying across the deck like the chatter of gulls. Some swore the dice were bewitched, others blamed the roll of the ship, but all returned again and again, eager for the brief excitement of chance in a world otherwise ruled by duty. Others preferred music to gambling. Sea shanties, rough and lively, rose in chorus, their rhythm matching the pull of ropes or the swing of hammocks. A single voice might begin a verse, low and steady before others joined in, weaving harmonies that were more enthusiastic than tuneful. These songs told of loves left behind, of taverns in distant ports, of the sea herself with all her moods and tempers. They were not polished ballads, but work songs, stitched together from fragments and repeated until they became as familiar as the creak of the rigging. To hear them was to feel the camaraderie of men who, though far from home, had made a kind of home in one another's company. Some sailors kept pets, small comforts in a world of rope and salt. Cats prowled the lower decks, their green eyes flashing in the lantern light as they chased rats from the stores. Birds, caught on islands and tamed with patient hands, sang from makeshift cages, their bright feathers a reminder of lands visited and lands still waiting. One man even kept a small monkey, gifted by islanders, which became a source of endless amusement as it clambered across, rigging and stole morsels from inattentive hands. These animals, though minor in the grand story of exploration, added colour to the voyage, and their antics gave rise to laughter that echoed across the deck. Meals, though meagre, also provided fodder for humour. Ship's biscuit, the eternal companion of sailors, was as hard as stone and often home to weevils. The men joked that it was a lottery whether they would eat bread or insects, and some claimed they preferred the insects for the added flavour. Salted pork, so heavily cured it might last years, was said to contain the entire ocean within its brine, and men teased that it had been cut from whales rather than pigs. Dried peas, boiled until they lost shape, were described as green fog in a pot, and cheese, when it appeared, was compared to oak planks. These jokes, repeated day after day, became part of the ritual, a way of transforming monotony into something bearable. It was humour born of necessity, the kind of humour that could make even a hard biscuit taste a little softer. Even in moments of frustration, the men found laughter. When ropes tangled or sails tore, curses flew as naturally as gulls. But once the work was done, the stories began. A mistake became a tale told later with exaggeration. The misstep of one man turned into a performance for the amusement of all. Laughter was not only entertainment, but also medicine, easing the sting of discipline and the weariness of labour. It created a bond stronger than rope, tying men together in shared absurdity. Cook, stern but observant, allowed such humour so long as it did not cross into disobedience. He understood that morale was as vital as discipline, that a laughing crew was a working crew. Banks, too, delighted in these scenes, sometimes joining the laughter, sometimes sketching the men at their games, preserving in his journals not only the rare plants of the Pacific, but also the ordinary cheer of sailors at play. Imagine yourself there, seated on a coil of rope as the sun dips low, the air warm with the scent of salt and tar, the deck alive with voices. A group of men hunch over their dice shouting at fortune, while others strum a fiddle or beat rhythm on an empty barrel. A cat slinks past, tail flicking, while above a monkey chatters from the rigging. Someone lifts a biscuit to the light, squinting at the movement within, before declaring with mock solemnity that supper has come alive of its own accord. Laughter erupts, rough and genuine, rolling across the deck like another wave in the endless sea. In that moment, the hardships fade, replaced by the simple joy of companionship. These routines, these small absurdities, were the ballast that kept spirits steady. Exploration may have filled the journals, but it was humour that filled the days. Without it, the voyage might have been unbearable. With it, the Pacific became not only a vast and uncertain expanse, but also a stage for jokes, songs, and small comforts that reminded the men of their humanity. And so, as you rest tonight, you might let their laughter carry you. Hear the dice clatter, the shanties rise, the monkey chatter, the jokes about biscuits and pork. Let it all become a background hum, a reminder that even in the most demanding journeys, life is not only duty and discovery, but also play, also joy, also laughter in the dark. Like the sailors of the Endeavour, you too can find comfort in small moments, and you too can let those moments carry you gently toward the horizon of sleep. Amid the laughter of sailors and the chatter of dice, amid the sketching of botanists and the chants of islanders, there remained always the steady figure of James Cook, captain of the Endeavour. He was not a man of flamboyance, nor one who raised his voice unless necessity demanded it. His presence was felt less in sudden bursts of command and more in the constant, quiet pressure of order, the way a keel steadies a ship unseen beneath the waves. To his men, he was both stern master and reliable guardian, a figure whose calm eyes measured not only the horizon, but also the temper of the crew. Cook's leadership was built upon discipline, for he knew that the sea was merciless to the careless. He demanded clean decks, tidy ropes, and strict attention to health, ordering fresh greens gathered whenever they reached land and insisting upon cleanliness in hammocks and quarters. Some men grumbled at the chores, yet they understood, even if reluctantly, that such rules kept them alive. Cook's voyages lost fewer men to scurvy than many others, a testament to his insistence on order and prevention. To him, discipline was not cruelty but care, a way of ensuring that the ship remained a floating world where survival depended upon shared responsibility. At times, he was stern, his voice cutting through the chatter like the crack of canvas in a sudden gust. A sailor who shirked his duty or ignored orders might find himself standing before the captain's table, Cook's gaze level and unwavering. Yet punishments were measured, never excessive, for Cook valued fairness as much as obedience. He knew that resentment could fester in close quarters, and so he balanced justice with restraint. His men might fear his authority, but many also respected it, recognizing in his manner a steadiness that mirrored the constancy of the stars. And yet, beyond this stern exterior, there were quieter moments when Cook revealed another side, one less often written in official logs. In the early hours before dawn, when the ship lay hushed in darkness and only the watch paced the deck, Cook would sometimes emerge silently, journal in hand, to record his observations. The lantern's glow lit his features, casting shadows across the lines of his face, while the faint scratch of his quill kept time with the roll of the waves. He noted bearings, latitudes, the shape of coastlines glimpsed, the direction of wind and swell. His handwriting, precise and deliberate, seemed almost immune to the motion of the sea. In those hours, he was not only a commander but a witness, translating the vastness of ocean into words and lines that would endure beyond the voyage itself. Sailors who encountered him in these moments often spoke later of the calm that surrounded him. He did not chatter idly, nor invite unnecessary conversation, yet his presence was not cold. It carried a kind of gravity, as though he understood the weight of the journey and bore it quietly so that others might carry less. One young midshipman, writing in his own diary, described Cook at dawn as a figure steady as the mast and silent as the sea when no wind blows. It was perhaps the highest compliment, for in a world where storms could rise suddenly and tempers could fray, to be steady was to be a kind of anchor. Cook's authority extended not only to his own crew, but also to encounters with the peoples of the Pacific. When meetings on shore grew tense, when voices rose and gestures hardened, it was often Cook who stepped forward, his posture firm yet his voice measured. He valued negotiation above conflict, preferring gifts and words to weapons. Tupaia's presence helped greatly, translating language and easing suspicion, but Cook's calm demeanour also played its part. He did not stride arrogantly, nor did he grovel. Instead, he stood with the quiet assurance of a man who believed in order even beyond the boundaries of his own ship. Many times his steadiness prevented escalation, turning what might have been hostility into an exchange of food, cloth, or knowledge. And yet, he was not without human restlessness. At times, his journals reveal a mind wearied by responsibility, a heart that longed for the simplicity of early days as a sailor rather than the endless weight of command. He was meticulous, but even meticulous men are human, and in his private words one senses both pride and fatigue. He did not romanticize the sea. He respected it, feared it when necessary, and always understood that it could not be tamed, only navigated. In this too there is wisdom, to see the world not as a stage for conquest, but as a force to be read with patience, like the stars above or the swell below. For the men aboard, Cook's leadership became a kind of background music, unseen, unspoken, but always present. Just as the creak of timbers and the slap of waves frame their days, so too did his discipline frame their voyage. They might laugh, play dice, sing shanties, and care for their pets, but beneath it all was the certainty that Cook watched, measured, and guided. That certainty was not a burden but a reassurance, the knowledge that while they might be far from home, adrift on waters wider than imagination, someone carried the map of their course with unwavering attention. Imagine yourself on the deck in the pale light of dawn, the horizon just beginning to blush with colour. The ship is still, save for the gentle rocking of waves, and a lantern glows near the captain's table. Cook bends over his journal, his face calm, his quill steady. The sailors sleep below, their dreams filled with laughter and song, but here, above, there is only the quiet presence of a man translating the sea into words. You stand at a distance watching him and feel the steadiness flow outward like the tide, a calm that settles not only the ship but also your own breath. For you, tonight, that steadiness can be your companion. Just as Cook held his crew together with discipline balanced by fairness, so too can you hold yourself gently, letting your thoughts drift without losing their rhythm. You're guided by a quiet presence, steady as the mast, constant as the dawn. And as you let your eyes grow heavy, you may rest in the assurance that the voyage continues safely, carried by leadership as calm and enduring as the sea itself. After weeks of sailing south and east, after the warmth of Tahiti and the slow rhythm of island lagoons, the Endeavour found itself before a coast unlike any it had seen before. It rose out of the sea with a stern majesty, cliffs dark against the foam, forests crowding thickly down to the shore, the air carrying a crispness different from the humid Pacific breezes left behind. This was Aotearoa, the land Europeans would come to call New Zealand, and for Cook and his men it was both discovery and challenge, a place already rich with people, stories, and traditions long before their sails appeared on the horizon. The first sounds that greeted them were not the drums of Tahiti, nor the songs of Polynesian dancers, but the thunder of surf striking the coast, each crash reverberating against rock and sand, joined by the distant calls of seabirds wheeling above. Smoke rose in thin spirals from inland fires, drifting against the pale sky, a sign that this land was not empty, not silent, but inhabited, alive with communities who had lived here for generations. The sailors leaned at the rail, peering toward those columns of smoke, whispering to one another, their voices carrying both curiosity and unease. For all their joking and laughter, there was an unspoken understanding that meeting new peoples could be as delicate as steering through reefs, and that caution must be their first companion. Cook, ever measured, brought the ship carefully along the coast, noting bays and headlands, sketching their forms in his journal. His pencil traced not only shapes of land, but also the rhythms of possibility. Safe harbours, dangerous shoals, places where anchors might hold or where reefs might tear the hull. To him, mapping was a way of transforming uncertainty into knowledge, yet he knew that lines on paper could not capture the fullness of what awaited ashore. Each inlet might hold voices, faces and hands, either open in greeting or raised in warning. The Maori who first sighted the Endeavour must have viewed it with wonder of their own. Imagine the scene from their vantage, a massive wooden structure rising from the sea taller than any canoe, its wings of canvas shifting with the wind, its hull groaning with unfamiliar sounds. To them, it may have looked like a floating fortress, a spirit from the horizon, or an intruder that needed to be watched with caution. Canoes set out from the beaches, swift and narrow, their paddlers chanting in rhythm, the spray flashing from their paddles in silver arcs. They circled the ship, their voices carrying across the water, strong and commanding, demanding to know who had come. The sailors, leaning over the side, watched with fascination, their hands tightening on ropes, their eyes wide at the sight of warriors painted and tattooed, their expressions fierce and proud. The air was thick with tension, the ship and the canoes regarding one another like two animals meeting in the forest, uncertain whether to fight or to accept each other's presence. Cook, however, remained calm, instructing Tupaia to step forward. The Tahitian priest and navigator, whose language and heritage connected him distantly to the Maori, raised his voice in words the islanders could understand. To the crew's astonishment, the tense shouts softened, replaced by cautious replies. A bridge had been built, not with weapons or gestures alone, but with the shared threads of language carried across oceans. Still, the encounters were not without strain. At times, misunderstandings flared, hands moved to weapons and warnings were shouted. Yet through patience, gifts, and the presence of Tupaia's voice, moments of calm returned. The sailors brought iron, nails, beads, and cloth, tokens that often intrigued the Maori, while in return came fish, roots, and words exchanged across the gulf of difference. For Cook, these meetings were as vital as any map, for they revealed not only coastlines but also the human geography of the land, the people whose stories and customs were as much a part of the place as its mountains and rivers. The landscapes of New Zealand unfolded slowly in his journals. Mountains rose inland, their peaks dusted with snow even as the coast remained green with fern and forest. Rivers cut through valleys, glittering in the sun, while beaches stretched in pale arcs where the surf never ceased its song. Birds called from the trees, some with cries unlike anything the sailors had ever heard, notes that seemed to mimic whistles or laughter. At night, fires glowed along the shore, their smoke mingling with the mist, their light reflected faintly upon the waves. The sailors watched from the deck, some uneasy, others awed, all aware that they were witnessing a land alive with presence. Banks, of course, was entranced. He hurried ashore at every safe opportunity, gathering plants unknown in Europe, sketching the intricate tattoos of the Maori, noting their clothing, their ornaments, their carvings. He pressed leaves between pages, filled notebooks with observations and returned to the ship, with specimens that amazed even his weary assistants. Yet even in his eagerness, he respected the people he met, writing not only of their customs but also of their dignity, their strength, their pride. To him, New Zealand was a garden and a library, both natural and human, its stories written in fern fronds and carved in wooden posts alike. The sailors, meanwhile, carried their humour into these encounters, though often in whispers once back aboard. They laughed nervously about the stern faces of the warriors, about the intricacy of tattoos they could never imagine sitting still long enough to endure, about the roots and foods that surprised their tongues with unfamiliar flavours. Yet beneath the laughter was respect, for they sensed that the Maori were not to be underestimated. These were not people to dismiss as simple or naive. They were strong, proud, and deeply rooted in their land, as formidable as the surf itself. Imagine yourself standing at the rail of the Endeavour as twilight deepens. The surf thunders against the rocks, and across the water you see the faint glow of fires, smoke rising in thin threads into the night sky. Voices carry on the breeze, chanting, singing, words you cannot understand but that fill the air with power and presence. The ship rocks gently, its lanterns swaying, while above, stars begin to prick the darkness. Cook bends over his journal, sketching the line of the coast, his pencil steady, while Tupaia gazes outward, his face thoughtful, as though hearing echoes carried across centuries. You stand there too, listening, watching, feeling both the awe of discovery and the humility of being a guest in a land long inhabited. For you, this moment can become a resting place. The surf's endless roar is like the steady rhythm of breath, powerful yet calming, constant as sleep itself. The smoke drifting upward is like your thoughts, rising and dissolving into the night sky. The lantern's glow upon the deck is like the quiet comfort of your own room. You are safe, steady, and carried forward, just as the Endeavour was carried along these shores, cautious but calm, observant but respectful, a ship among people, a traveller among stories. There are times on a voyage when the work of hauling ropes, cleaning decks, and charting coasts fades into the background, and what rises instead are the stories that fill the spaces between duties. For the men of the Endeavour, those spaces often opened at night, when the sails hung quiet in a steady breeze and the ship rocked gently on a dark and endless sea. Then, beneath the stars, voices turned toward legends, myths, and whispered tales of what might lie beyond the horizon. In the Pacific, where islands seemed to appear like miracles out of mist, the imagination had no shortage of material to feed upon. From the Polynesians they encountered came stories older than charts, stories carried in chants, dances, and the patterns woven into bark cloth, around, firelight on Tahiti, or along the shores of New Zealand. Cook's crew sometimes listened, not always understanding the words but feeling the power of rhythm and gesture. They heard of Tangaroa, the god of the sea, whose vast arms embraced every wave, whose moods determined whether a voyage would be safe or doomed. They heard of Maui, the trickster hero who fished islands up from the ocean floor with a magical hook, laughing as mountains rose dripping from the depths. These were not tales of fantasy to those who told them, but living truths, reminders that the ocean was not empty but alive, inhabited by gods, ancestors, and spirits who moved as surely as the tides. The sailors, hardened by years of labour and salted rations, were not immune to such tales. Some chuckled afterward, dismissing the stories as superstition, yet in the privacy of their hammocks they could not help but glance uneasily at the heaving sea. Was it truly so impossible that monsters lurked beneath, that islands could rise where none had been, that storms carried voices not only of wind but of spirits displeased? After all, had they not seen strange creatures themselves, fish with wings, birds with cries like laughter, animals on shore that defied description? It was easy to scoff at myths in daylight, harder in the hush of night when every creak of timber and every splash beyond the hull felt like a whisper from something unseen. Banks, ever curious, recorded these stories with fascination. To him, they were part of the Pacific's library, another form of knowledge to be preserved alongside plants and shells. He sketched figures from carvings, noted chants translated by Tupaia, and marvelled at how myth and navigation intertwined. He realised that the stars themselves were woven into stories, each constellation not only a cluster of light, but also a chapter in an ongoing tale of creation and travel. Where Cook measured angles, Polynesians told of voyages made possible by gods guiding their canoes, and Banks understood that in both cases the sky was a map, whether written in numbers or in song. Cook, though more reserved, could not wholly ignore the weight of these myths. His journals spoke of curious tales told by the islanders, and though he placed them alongside notes of latitude and longitude, one senses a subtle respect in his words. He did not believe in Maui's hook or Tangaroa's temper, yet he recognised that for the people of these islands such figures explained the world with a clarity as real as his own compasses. To him, myths were not threats to science, but another kind of chart, drawn not with ink but with imagination. And perhaps, in the quiet of night, he too wondered whether there was not some truth hidden in metaphor, some wisdom in the idea that the sea was alive and demanded reverence. The sailors, of course, added their own tales. Around lanterns hung in the gloom below deck, they whispered of sea monsters that had followed ships for days, of mermaids glimpsed at dusk with hair streaming like seaweed, of ghostly lights hovering over waves. Some of these stories were old, carried from voyages in the Atlantic. Others invented anew to amuse or to frighten younger hands. A boy might lie awake in his hammock, wide-eyed at the thought of enormous creatures rising silently from the depths, their eyes like lanterns, their breath like steam. Laughter followed such tales, but always with a nervous edge, as though part of each man wondered whether the ocean's silence concealed more than waves. Imagine yourself among them, seated on a coil of rope as the night air cools, the stars stretching wide above. Tupaia's voice carries softly, telling of Maui and the islands he pulled from the sea, his hands gesturing toward the dark horizon. The sailors listen, some smiling, some serious, the firelight from the shore flickering in their eyes. Later, as the ship drifts farther into night, another sailor begins his own story, of a monster with scales like armour and a mouth that could swallow a boat whole. His words are rougher, his tone half mocking, yet when silence falls again, the men shift uneasily, staring into the water as though expecting a ripple to confirm the tale. For you, listening now, these stories can be a reminder of the human need to explain, to imagine, to weave meaning from the unknown. Whether by gods and heroes or by sextants and compasses, people have always sought to map the vastness that surrounds them. The Polynesians mapped with myth, the sailors with rumour, Cook with journals, Banks with sketches, and you with the quiet lines of thought drifting through your mind as you rest. Each method is a way of saying, we are here, we belong to this vastness, and we will make sense of it as best we can. So the nights of the Endeavour were filled not only with stars and waves, but with voices telling tales. Some were scientific, some legendary, some humorous, some fearful, but altogether they formed the chorus of the voyage, the sound of men and peoples trying to understand the immensity of sea and sky. And as you drift now towards sleep, you may let those voices merge into one gentle murmur, stories dissolving into the rhythm of waves, myths blending with dreams, until the ocean of the night carries you as softly as it carried the ship itself. In the Pacific, the sea itself was a meeting place, a vast expanse where different worlds drifted into sight of one another. For the Endeavour, heavy with masts and canvas, planks thick with tar, sails billowing like enormous wings, every encounter with island canoes carried the feeling of two separate universes brushing close. The canoes, narrow and swift, skimmed across the water with a grace the English sailors could hardly fathom, their hulls light enough to ride the crest of a wave rather than struggle against it, their paddlers moving in rhythm so fluid it seemed less like labour and more like a dance, where the Endeavour groaned and creaked with every adjustment. The canoes whispered across the lagoon, their paddles dipping silently, leaving only faint ripples to mark their passage. When these vessels met, the contrast was almost overwhelming. Sailors leaned over the rails to gape at canoes so slender they looked fragile as reeds, yet they carried warriors, families, baskets of fruit, and even animals. To the islanders, the Endeavour must have looked like a floating mountain, its sails white cliffs, its rigging a forest of ropes and shadows. Both sides marvelled, both sides whispered, both sides felt the unease of curiosity. The sea between them became not empty water, but a threshold, a line where two different traditions of travel, two philosophies of movement, touched for a moment before drifting apart again. It was in these encounters that Tupaia's role revealed its full value. Standing on the deck with Cook and Banks at his side, he called out in Polynesian tongues, his voice carrying easily across the waves. For the Maori in New Zealand, or for islanders elsewhere in the Pacific, his words were not perfect translations but close enough to spark recognition, enough to remind them that they shared ancestors' songs and stars. Shouts from the canoes grew softer, arms lowered, and exchanges began. Bananas and fish passed upward, beads and nails lowered down, gestures of peace made tangible through objects that crossed the space between wood and canvas. Without Tupaia, the gap might have widened into hostility, but with him it became a crossroads, a place where bridges could be built. Cook noted these encounters with the precision of a cartographer, recording not only the shape of coasts but the number of canoes, the nature of their approach, the words Tupaia exchanged. He saw the value of negotiation and the necessity of calm. The sailors, less formal, remembered the human details, the smiles, the laughter, the astonishment when iron was placed in islanders' hands for the first time, the way fruit tasted fresher than anything they had eaten in months. They joked afterward that the canoes, so small beside the Endeavour, could nevertheless outpace them easily within the lagoon, darting like fish around the lumbering bulk of the ship. At night, back aboard, the men spoke of what they had seen. Some were amazed at the skill of canoe building, the intricacy of lashings, the way sails of woven mat caught the wind. Others whispered about the warriors' tattoos, the confidence of their movements, the certainty with which they paddled through surf. Banks, eager as always, sketched and annotated, preserving the forms of canoes and paddles with as much care as he gave to orchids and breadfruit. For him, these vessels were as much a part of the Pacific's natural and cultural history as any plant or bird. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. A canoe and a ship meeting in mid-water was more than a chance encounter. It was a metaphor for two ways of knowing the world. The canoe represented intimacy, knowledge carried in the body, memory of stars and swells passed through generations. The ship represented scale, iron nails and journals filled with measurements, maps meant to endure in libraries. Neither was superior, neither was lesser. They were different answers to the same question: how does one cross an ocean? The sailors, even in their jest, sensed this truth, that the canoes gliding like arrows across the waves revealed a mastery of the sea not unlike their own, only shaped by a different tradition. Tupaia himself must have felt both pride and melancholy in these moments. Pride in demonstrating to the English the sophistication of his people's navigation, pride in hearing his words answered from across the waves. Yet perhaps also melancholy, for he must have known that this meeting of worlds was not equal, that the bulk of the Endeavour carried with it not only curiosity but also power, and that the balance of exchange might one day tilt beyond repair. But in that moment, as voices called and fruit changed hands, as laughter rose and gestures softened, It was enough to stand between, to be the translator, the bridge, the human thread binding two traditions together for a brief instant upon the sea. Imagine yourself there, leaning at the rail as the sun slants low across the water. The canoes shimmer in golden light, their paddlers' bodies gleaming with spray, their movements strong yet unhurried. The Endeavour looms above, its sails catching the same light, glowing pale against the evening sky. Between them stretches a strip of sea where gifts pass from hand to hand, where words cross through Tupaia's voice, where suspicion gives way to curiosity. You feel the hush of that moment, the fragile piece balanced like a canoe upon a wave, delicate yet enduring. Later, as night falls and the canoes retreat toward the shore, their fires glowing faintly in the distance, the ship settles into its own quiet. The sailors talk softly, their laughter mingled with wonder, their dice forgotten for the evening. Cook writes in his journal, Banks sketches by lantern, and Tupaia sits silently, gazing at the stars, perhaps tracing in his mind the routes his ancestors once followed across this same sea. The crossroads remains not only upon the water but also in memory, a reminder that even in the vastness of the Pacific, worlds are always meeting, always weaving together, if only for a moment. And for you tonight, the image of canoe and ship can become a metaphor for rest. The canoe, light and intimate, is like your breath, steady and close. The ship, vast and enduring, is like your body, carrying you forward through the night. Between them lies the ocean of sleep, wide but calm, waiting to hold you as gently as it held them both. You need not choose between canoe or ship, science or story. You need only drift with both, carried into dreams by the same rhythm that carried them across the Pacific. Time equals 1.5 seconds. When the work of the day was finished, when sails were furled and notes and journals laid aside, there came evenings when the men of the Endeavour stepped ashore and found themselves gathered not in stern discipline but in the circle of a fire. These were the moments that softened the distance between worlds, when sailors and islanders sat shoulder to shoulder beneath palm fronds and starlight, the ocean's steady pulse sounding just beyond the beach. It was there, around the glow of flame, that curiosity found its gentlest expression, not in commands or negotiations, but in laughter, in food passed from hand to hand, and in songs whose meanings were not always understood, but whose spirit needed no translation. Imagine the firelight flickering against faces both familiar and strange, shadows stretching long across the sand while sparks drift upward into the night. The smell of smoke mingled with the sweet scent of roasting breadfruit, its skin blistering and cracking to reveal soft white flesh inside. Bananas lay in woven baskets, their peels curling back as they warmed, while fish sizzled upon stones, the salt of the sea carried into their flavour. To men who had endured months of biscuit and salted pork, the feast was a revelation, each bite a reminder that the world, though vast and uncertain, could also be generous. Laughter rose as sailors fumbled with foods they had never seen before, attempting to peel or crack or bite. Their awkwardness met with patient smiles from their hosts. The islanders, amused by their clumsy enthusiasm, guided them with gestures and laughter, turning every mistake into another reason for mirth. Joseph Banks often sat near the fire with notebook open, his face illuminated by both flame and delight. He wrote of breadfruit roasted until it fell apart like soft bread, of coconuts whose milk cooled the throat after the heat of fire, of fruits whose colours gleamed even in the dimness. Yet beyond his scientific descriptions, there was in his writing an undercurrent of wonder, the recognition that food was not merely sustenance but also language. The sharing of a meal was a way of saying you're welcome here, you are part of us tonight, and Banks, who had catalogued thousands of plants, understood that no pressed leaf could carry the meaning of roasted breadfruit shared in laughter under the stars. The sailors, less inclined to note details, expressed their gratitude in their own way, through loud praise, through exaggerated groans of pleasure at the first sweet bite, through songs offered in return. One would pull out a fiddle, its strings roughened by salt air, and begin a tune half remembered from a tavern in England. The notes carried across the circle, hesitant at first, then stronger as others joined in with voices clapping hands, stamping feet. The islanders listened, some swaying to the rhythm, some laughing at the unfamiliar cadences, and then, in response, they began their own song. Their voices rose in harmony, deep and resonant, carrying patterns as ancient as the waves. The sailors fell silent, listening in awe, feeling the music thrum in their bones like the heartbeat of the island itself. It was in these exchanges that barriers dissolved most easily. Words often faltered, mistranslations stumbled, but music and food needed no explanation. A sailor might not know the meaning of the chant rising across the fire, but he felt its power in the way it moved the air, the way it stirred something deep and nameless within. Likewise, the islanders might not understand the English words of a shanty, but they recognized the laughter, the stomping rhythm, the joy of voices raised together. Around the fire, difference became less important than presence. They were simply people, warmed by the same flames, fed by the same hands, rocked by the same ocean that whispered beyond the reef. Cook, watching from the edge of these gatherings, allowed the men their freedom. He was not a man given to indulgence, but he understood the importance of morale, of the bonds formed in these small hours. He noted in his journals that such evenings fostered goodwill, eased tensions, and built bridges more effective than any show of arms. He did not join in the dancing or the singing, but one can imagine him standing quietly, arms folded, a faint smile hidden in shadow, content to let laughter fill the air. For all his discipline, he knew that a voyage was carried not only by charts and compasses, but also by the strength of the men's spirits, and nothing strengthened them more than a night of warmth and welcome. Picture yourself now on that beach, seated close to the fire, the sand cool beneath you, the air warm against your face. You hold a piece of breadfruit, its skin crackling, its flesh steaming, and as you break it open, the scent rises, earthy and comforting. You hear laughter beside you, the deep voice of a sailor mixing with the musical tones of an islander, their amusement joined into a single chorus. Across the circle, Banks sketches quickly, trying to catch the way firelight plays upon hair and garland, while nearby a sailor strums his fiddle, the notes joining the crackle of fire and the hush of waves. Above, the stars glitter, countless and steady, the same stars that guided canoes and ships alike to this shared shore. As the evening deepens, the songs soften. Some sit quietly, heads bowed, full of food and drowsy with contentment. The fire burns lower, glowing embers painting the sand in red and gold. The ocean, steady as ever, continues its long sigh against the reef, its rhythm matching the slow breathing of those gathered. In this hush, there is a sense of peace rare in voyages, a sense that for a moment the world has paused, not in tension, but in harmony. Sailors and islanders alike drift into silence, not because words fail, but because none are needed. And for you, listening in the quiet of your own room, this fire can be your own resting place. The warmth you feel in your imagination is like the warmth of your blanket, the crackle of embers like the soft creak of your home settling, the hush of surf like the rhythm of your breath. You're safe within the circle of this campfire, welcomed by voices that laugh, sing, and rest beside you. The night stretches wide, the stars remain above, and you are carried gently towards sleep, as steady and comforting as the ocean tide that has always whispered its lullaby beyond the shore. After many months of sailing across seas that seemed endless, the Endeavour came upon a coast that was at once stark and mesmerizing, a land unfamiliar in colour and form. The island chains of the Pacific had offered lagoons of green and gold, warm breezes heavy with flowers, and canoes darting across turquoise shallows. but here the shoreline stretched long and rugged, with headlands of red earth and forests that looked different from any they had yet seen. The air itself carried a new scent, dry and resinous, touched with the sharpness of eucalyptus leaves, unlike the sweet perfumes of Tahiti or the damp smoke of New Zealand fires. This was the Great Southland, which Cook would later mark on his charts as Australia, though for the men it felt less like a map's line, and more like the sudden opening of a door into another world. Joseph Banks, restless with anticipation, was among the first to set foot ashore when Cook allowed it. He bent at once to gather specimens, his eyes darting from leaf to leaf, each plant stranger than the last. Some leaves were thick and waxy, others fine and spindly. Blossoms blazed with colours that seemed almost unreal in their brightness. He and Daniel Solander filled their bags with samples, pressing flowers, labelling seeds, sketching branches. Banks's journal soon brimmed with descriptions of plants so unusual they seemed as though nature herself had decided to begin again, designing anew with shapes and hues unfamiliar to European eyes. The sailors, less interested in foliage, soon found their own amazement in the creatures that moved about the land. Kangaroos, leaping in great arcs across the grass, startled them into laughter and disbelief. Some swore the animals were half deer, half giant rat, bounding on powerful hind legs while balancing with long tails. Others stood silent, mouths agape, as flocks of birds passed overhead. Cockatoos with crests of white and yellow, parrots flashing red and green, cries piercing and unfamiliar. Insects too large to ignore buzzed in the air, their wings shimmering in the sunlight, while lizards scuttled over rocks, their scales catching the light in metallic flashes. Cook, ever precise, focused first on the coast. He sketched its outline, measuring depths near shore, noting reefs and channels. His pencil traced bays and headlands, leaving behind the beginnings of what would become detailed charts of a continent. Yet even he could not remain unmoved by the strangeness of the land. He recorded in his journals the cries of birds that mimicked whistles, the sight of animals never before described in Europe, the peculiarities of soil and tree. Though practical in tone, one can sense between his lines a quiet astonishment, a recognition that the Pacific still held wonders no sextant could measure. It was here, at a bay rich with plant life, that Banks's collections reached their height. He and his companions roamed with near frantic energy, gathering specimens until their presses bulged. So abundant were the discoveries that Cook named the place Botany Bay, a tribute to the natural riches that so delighted his botanists. Banks wrote that no day passed without the finding of something new, that each hour seemed to offer another plant, another insect, another bird whose colours defied description. To him, this land was a blooming library, its pages infinite, its knowledge waiting patiently to be read. The evenings ashore carried their own atmosphere. Fires were lit near the beach, and the men cooked fish caught in nets, their smoke curling upward into skies tinged orange with sunset. The sound of the surf blended with the calls of unseen creatures from the forest, some shrill, some deep, each cry reminding the sailors that this land was alive in ways they did not yet understand. They sat in small groups, chewing thoughtfully, sometimes laughing at the memory of kangaroos bounding like phantoms, sometimes speaking softly of how far they had travelled, how far home now seemed. For Banks, these moments were treasure as much as any specimen. He wrote not only of plants, but also of the feeling of standing in a place that seemed both alien and welcoming, a place where every tree, bird and creature seemed designed to remind him of nature's endless inventiveness. He pressed leaves gently between sheets of paper, knowing that long after the voyage ended, these fragile samples would speak of Australia to those who'd never set foot here. The sailors, though less scholarly, felt their own wonder. One carved the figure of a kangaroo into the handle of his knife, another kept a parrot feather tucked into his cap, Still another laughed that the land itself must be upside down to have produced animals so peculiar. Their humour softened the strangeness, turning bewilderment into story, making the unfamiliar part of their shared memory. Imagine yourself standing with them on the edge of Botany Bay. The sun sinks low, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. The air is warm but carries a faint dryness, as though the land breathes differently here. To your left, Banks crouches over a plant, murmuring to himself as he sketches its form. To your right, sailors laugh at the sight of kangaroos bounding across the distance, their silhouettes etched against the fading light. Behind you, the Endeavour lies at anchor, her masts rising dark against the horizon, a reminder that though you have stepped onto new land, the voyage continues. Above, the first stars prick the sky, familiar yet strange in their positions, constellations shifting as the ship drifts farther into the southern seas. For you tonight, this scene can be a reminder that strangeness need not bring fear, that what is unfamiliar can also be beautiful, that every journey holds moments where the world seems to have turned a page and revealed an entirely new chapter. Just as the men of the Endeavour found delight in plants and creatures beyond imagination, so too can you find peace in the thought that discovery is not only the grand event, but also the quiet noticing, the simple act of paying attention to what lies before you. Let your thoughts, like Banks's hands, press gently against the details of your own life, preserving them, treasuring them, until sleep gathers you in its calm embrace. The Pacific is vast enough to hold many moods, and while it often spread calm as far as the horizon, there were nights when it turned suddenly fierce, when the ocean reminded those upon it that they were small guests riding upon its back. For the men of the Endeavour, storms were never unexpected, but their arrival always felt like a shock after long stretches of gentle water, like the sudden roar of a crowd in a silent hall. One moment the sails hung easy in a steady breeze, the ship gliding forward with the patience of a drifting cloud, and the next the sky darkened, the wind stiffened, and the first cold drops of rain stung the skin like warning taps upon the shoulder. The transformation was swift. Clouds gathered thick and heavy, pressing low, their bellies swollen with thunder. Lightning split the distance, jagged lines illuminating the rigging in sharp flashes. The sails, once full, cracked and whipped violently, their canvas straining as though to tear free. Men scrambled aloft, their bodies outlined in sudden light, silhouettes swaying against the storm, hands gripping ropes slick with rain. Shouts echoed across the deck, orders, warnings, cries to haul and reef. The ship, so steady hours before, now lurched and groaned, timbers straining against the power of waves that rose like hills, their crests breaking in foaming collapse. Below deck, hammocks swung wildly, buckets spilled, dice and cards skittered across the floor. The air was filled with the sharp tang of tar, wet rope and fear, though it was a fear woven with determination. The sailors had seen storms before, and though each one carried danger, their bodies remembered the rhythm of survival. They moved with urgency but not panic, their laughter absent, their voices tightened, yet their hands steady on ropes and wheels. Cook himself remained calm, his voice cutting through wind and thunder, directing sails, adjusting course, his presence a mast of discipline amid chaos. The storm grew louder still. Thunder rolled across the sky like enormous drums, each clap shaking the chest as though the heavens themselves were beating upon the world. Rain poured in sheets, stinging faces, soaking clothes, filling the scuppers until water streamed across the deck. Lanterns swung violently, their flames sputtering, shadows leaping in frantic arcs across wet wood. For hours the men worked, hands blistered, backs aching, voices hoarse, while the ship pitched and rolled, each wave threatening to capsize it, each gust tearing at canvas with the fury of unseen giants. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the storm relented. The thunder faded into distant rumbles, the lightning flickered and died, the rain thinned to a mist and then ceased. The sea, which moments earlier had risen like mountains, settled back into long, heavy swells. The sails, torn and patched, filled again with gentler wind. Exhausted men collapsed against barrels and rails, their chests heaving, their clothes clinging to their skin. They laughed again, but now with relief, their voices trembling with the knowledge that they had passed through another trial. Cook, still calm, noted the damage, already planning repairs, his face showing little but his eyes perhaps revealing the quiet gratitude of survival. As night deepened, the storm left behind a stillness almost unreal. The sea, polished by rain, lay smooth as glass beneath the stars. The ship drifted forward slowly, her reflection shimmering in the dark water as though she sailed through the sky itself. The men, weary but wakeful, leaned against the rail, gazing upward at constellations sharpened by the cleansed air. The Milky Way stretched bright and endless, a river of light across the heavens, mirrored by the gentle swell below. No one spoke loudly. Voices, when they came, were hushed, almost reverent. The same men who had shouted into the storm now whispered as though in a temple, their eyes wide with awe at the beauty left in the storm's wake. Banks, still clutching his notebook though its pages were damp, scribbled a few lines about the transformation, about how the fury of nature gave way to serenity, how terror and wonder were often separated by only a few hours. He wrote that the ocean was not only a force but a teacher, that its violence and its calm were two halves of the same lesson. Cook, practical as ever, wrote of sails to be mended, ropes to be replaced, yet even he must have looked up once or twice, his face illuminated by starlight, and felt the strange comfort of silence after thunder. The sailors, drying their clothes, whispered stories of storms they had endured before. Some laughed at the fear on a young boy's face as he clung to a rope. Others spoke with pride of scars earned in rough seas. Still others grew quiet, remembering comrades lost on other voyages to waves that had not relented. Yet on this night all were alive, and the stillness seemed like a gift, a soft blanket laid upon the world after its violent shaking. Imagine yourself there, standing on deck in the deep hush. The air is cool and clean, the wood beneath your feet still damp, the sails above shifting gently. Around you, the men breathe softly, their eyes fixed on the stars, while the ocean reflects those same stars until you feel as though you float in space itself, between two skies. The memory of thunder still lingers in your bones, but now it is softened, transformed into gratitude. You breathe deeply, slowly, and the calm spreads within you like a tide. For you, this moment is a reminder that storms, whether of sea, sky, or thought, do not last forever. They rise with power, shake us with their force, and then pass, leaving behind a quiet more profound than what came before. Just as the sailors felt awe at the glassy sea and the glittering stars, so too can you rest tonight in the knowledge that calm follows chaos, that peace follows noise, that stillness waits patiently behind every storm. There came long stretches of the voyage when the horizon seemed never to change, when the ship moved forward day after day, but the view before her remained the same. Water, sky, a thin line dividing the two. The Pacific, at its most immense, was less a place to travel through than a vast condition of being, an endless field of blue that stretched beyond imagination. For the men of the Endeavour, these weeks were neither triumph nor disaster, but something quieter, a slow passage through immensity, where the ocean itself became both companion and challenge. In those days, the rhythm of life on board settled into its deepest pattern. The watches turned without hurry, one crew relieving another, the wheel passed from hand to hand, the sails adjusted with the changing wind. Meals arrived with the same monotony as the view. biscuit, salted meat, dried peas. Even humour about the food grew stale after a time, repeated so often that it became a kind of ritual chant, more comfort than complaint. The air smelled of tar and salt, the decks creaked, the ropes groaned, and the men found themselves lulled by these unchanging sounds until they became the backdrop of every thought. Yet within this sameness lay the chance for small joys. Sailors carved scraps of wood into shapes, tiny ships, crude animals, or figures of loved ones remembered from home. They whittled with patience, letting the hours dissolve into the slow shaping of a piece of timber. Others stitched torn clothing, their needles flashing briefly in the sun, or braided ropes into small keepsakes. Some told stories, voices low and steady as the ship rocked, tales of past voyages, of taverns in distant ports, of storms survived, of friends lost. A few stories were exaggerated into near myth, while others were whispered with reverence, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the memory of those gone. At night, when the stars rose, the immensity of the Pacific revealed itself most clearly. The sky stretched like an infinite dome, filled with points of light so numerous that no ink could ever record them all. The ocean mirrored that sky, reflecting constellations until the ship seemed to drift not on water, but between two galaxies, each wave a ripple across the fabric of space. Sailors on watch grew quiet in such hours, their voices hushed as though speaking too loudly might break the spell. Some leaned on the rail, staring upward until their eyes blurred, letting the stars sink into their minds like seeds of dreams. Tupaia, when asked, sometimes explained the sky in his way, pointing to constellations the Europeans didn't name, describing paths across the heavens that led to islands unseen by Cook's maps. The sailors listened, some sceptical, others enchanted, but all aware that here, in this vastness, the stars were the only certain companions. Cook measured them with his sextant, Banks wrote of them in his journal, but for the crew they were simply the lanterns of night, steady, unchanging, eternal. There were moments when the immensity pressed heavily, when the men longed for land, for the feel of grass beneath their feet, for the sight of trees rising against the horizon. They spoke of home in these hours, of families left behind, of familiar streets, of smells of bread and ale. The ocean seemed endless then, a prison of blue with no walls but no escape either. Some grew restless, pacing the deck, staring into the distance as though sheer will might summon land from the mist. Yet even in these moods, the ocean had its way of soothing. Its rhythm of waves, steady as breath, calmed anger, softened longing, and reminded the men that patience was as necessary as wind. Banks once wrote in his journal that the Pacific seemed like a living creature, a breathing giant whose chest rose and fell in swells, whose sighs were the waves themselves, whose heartbeat was the endless pulse of tide. To sail across it was not to conquer it, but to rest upon it, to be carried upon its breathing as a child is carried upon the chest of a sleeping parent. The sailors did not write such metaphors, but they felt them. Lying in their hammocks, rocked gently back and forth, they knew the ocean cradled them even in its immensity. Imagine yourself standing at the rail during one of those long afternoons, the sun high, the sea stretching in every direction, the horizon blurred by heat. The ship creaks, the sails flap softly, the voices of men are low and measured. You look outward and see nothing but blue, yet in that nothingness there is a strange fullness, a completeness that needs no adornment. The ocean breathes, rising and falling, and you find your own breath matching its rhythm, slow, steady, unhurried. At dusk, the sky blazes with colour, crimson and violet bleeding into gold, the water catching every hue until the world itself seems aflame. The sailors gather quietly, some in awe, some weary, but all watching. For a few moments the monotony is broken by sheer beauty, and then night comes, stars scattering themselves like jewels across velvet. The immensity returns, but now it feels less like a burden and more like a blanket, soft and enveloping, endless yet intimate. For you tonight, the Pacific's vastness can be a reminder of calm rather than emptiness. Picture the ocean as a breathing giant. It swells the rise and fall of its chest, its tides the slow rhythm of its heart. You're safe upon it, rocked by its constancy, lulled by its patience. Just as the sailors found their peace in carving wood, in telling stories, in staring at the stars, so too can you find peace in your own small rituals, your breath, your thoughts, your dreams. The horizon may seem endless, but it holds you gently, carrying you forward, always forward, upon its great and patient tide. After the long stretches of open water, when horizon and sky had merged into one unbroken line, the appearance of new land always brought a stir across the decks. This time, as the Endeavour drew nearer, the land rose from the sea in soft curves of mountains, green slopes broken by valleys where clouds rested like cushions. The air shifted too, carrying not the dry scent of Australia, nor the resin of eucalyptus, but a sweetness laced with salt, as though the island itself breathed out warmth. This was Hawaii, though to Cook and his men it was still a new and unnamed world, a place revealed slowly in the haze of dawn as the ship glided closer. Canoes approached before the shore was fully in sight, their paddlers chanting in rhythm, the sound carrying across the water like a drumbeat made of voices. The canoes skimmed the waves with grace, their hulls cutting cleanly, their sails of woven mat catching the breeze. From the ship the sailors leaned out, craning to see the figures within, men with tattoos coiling along their skin, women with garlands in their hair, children laughing as they balanced at the bows. The chants grew louder as the distance closed, a sound not threatening but powerful, a chorus of welcome and strength. It was music of belonging, a reminder that these seas, so vast and empty to European eyes, were in truth threaded with people who knew every current, every star, every shore. Tupaia stepped forward again, his voice bridging the waters. His words, spoken in familiar Polynesian cadences, were met with answering cries, recognition sparking across the gap. Smiles followed, gestures softened, gifts were raised high, bundles of fruit, woven mats, fish glistening in the sun. In return, beads and cloth were lowered from the Endeavour, iron nails passed carefully into outstretched hands. The sailors marvelled at the abundance and generosity. Their hunger quickened not only for food but for connection, for the warmth of laughter after weeks of emptiness. Joseph Banks, as always, took notes with excitement, describing the richness of flora glimpsed even from the shore. Palms swaying above huts thatched with grass, vines twisting along the sand, blossoms vivid against the green. He imagined already the sketches he would make, the specimens he would make, would press, the stories he would bring back to England of islands so abundant they seemed gardens scattered upon the sea. Cook, meanwhile, measured distances, marked the lay of bays and reefs, his pencil tracing again the outlines of a world unknown to his maps. Yet even his journals betray a kind of wonder, the recognition that this place was not only a coast to be charted, but a world alive with sound and spirit. The welcome on shore was vibrant. As the sailors disembarked, drums echoed from deeper inland, their steady beat guiding them toward gatherings where dancers moved in swaying unison. Garlands of flowers were draped over necks, the petals cool and fragrant against sunburned skin. Food was placed in hands. Roasted pig, taro steamed in leaves, fruits cut open to reveal soft, sweet flesh. The men ate with wide eyes and grateful murmurs, astonished by the abundance after the long monotony of shipboard fare. Laughter rose freely now, mingled with the rhythms of chants and the deep thrum of drums, creating a soundscape that felt both grounding and uplifting, a music of earth and ocean together. The sailors, never shy of humour, teased one another as they attempted to mimic the dances, their clumsy steps drawing roars of laughter from their hosts. One man stumbled, arms flailing before collapsing into the sand, only to rise with a grin and a garland newly placed upon his head. Another tried to beat a drum but struck too fast, his rhythm falling into chaos, until a child took his hands and guided them into the proper tempo. These moments of laughter bridged differences more surely than words could, creating bonds woven from shared amusement. Cook, though less demonstrative, observed with keen eyes. He saw the discipline behind the chants, the unity in the movements of dancers, the coordination of canoes gliding across waves. He recognized the sophistication of these islanders, their mastery of the sea, their abundance of food and culture. In his journal, he recorded not only geography but also impressions of a people who lived richly within their world, a world the Europeans were only beginning to glimpse. At night, the beach glowed with firelight. Flames crackled against the dark, casting shadows that danced with the rhythm of bodies moving in time to chants. The surf whispered steadily behind, its hush blending with drums into a single pulse that seemed to carry the whole island. Sailors sat in circles, their faces golden with firelight, their bodies heavy with food and contentment. Some leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to songs they could not understand but could feel deep within, the tones resonant as the ocean itself. Banks sketched by lamplight, his pencil racing to capture postures and ornaments before they faded into memory. Cook wrote by his lantern, careful as ever, yet even he must have felt the pull of fire and drum, the ancient rhythm that linked every human heart across land and sea. Imagine yourself seated there. The sand cool beneath you, a garland around your shoulders, the scent of flowers and smoke mingling in the air. Before you, dancers move with grace, their arms sweeping wide, their feet pressing rhythms into the ground. Behind you, the ocean breathes in slow sighs, its tide rising and falling like a giant's chest. Around you, laughter and chant mingle, human voices woven into nature's music. You feel both guest and participant, held in the warmth of welcome, carried by a tide of sound and scent that is both new and eternal. And for you tonight, this vision of Hawaii can be a resting place. The drums that once quickened the sailors' hearts can become for you the slow rhythm of your own pulse, steady and calming. The surf beyond the fire is like your own breath, in and out, unhurried. The garland of flowers is like the blanket upon your shoulders, light yet comforting. As you close your eyes, you're seated among companions, safe in warmth and song, carried gently by the vast Pacific that has brought you here. The island glows, the fire softens, and you drift into the calm of dreams, just as the Endeavour drifted onward into the heart of its journey. As the Endeavour carried her company farther across the ocean, her decks worn smooth by countless footsteps, and her sails patched with care, the voyage began to gather itself into memory even while it was still unfolding. For Cook, whose journals were never far from hand, reflection was as much a duty as steering or measuring. Each evening, after the ship had settled into its watch and the lanterns swung gently from their hooks, he bent over his pages, quill steady, and recorded the day's course. His words traced not only distances and bearings, but also the feel of wind, the look of land, the presence of people met along the way. With each line, the Pacific, vast, elusive, immeasurable, was given form, captured not in entirety but in fragments that together wove a map of discovery. Imagine the weight of those journals, the careful ink pressed into paper, the steady hand that refused to falter even when seas rose or decks pitched. Cook's pages were more than records. They were a dialogue with the ocean itself, a way of saying, I see you, I measure you, I carry you into memory. And yet, between the practical notes, one can sense the quiet awe of a man who, though bound to duty, could not remain untouched by the immensity around him. In his lines about coastlines and reefs, there is also a silence, a reverence, as though the ocean's vastness demanded not only observation, but respect. Banks too filled his notebooks, though his reflections took a different shape. Where Cook wrote of reefs and bays, Banks described flowers, birds, and the laughter of strangers who became companions for an evening. He pressed petals between pages, drew sketches by firelight, and allowed himself the luxury of wonder where Cook remained practical. Together, their journals complemented one another. Cook's the skeleton of the voyage, Banks's the flesh and colour. Between them the Pacific became not only measured space but lived experience, a place both charted and cherished. The sailors, less inclined to write, carried their reflections in stories, repeated night after night until they grew polished like stones turned by the tide. They spoke of storms endured, of islands found, of feasts by fire, of laughter shared with people whose languages they could not speak yet, whose songs they could still hum. Their reflections were oral, their memory a chorus of voices that drifted across hammocks and watch rotations, stories told half in jest, half in reverence, always stitched with the knowledge that they had been part of something larger than themselves. As the voyage stretched on, reflection became less about single events and more about the immensity of the Pacific itself. The ocean seemed to defy comprehension, its horizons endless, its depths unfathomable. To Cook, it was a puzzle slowly assembled, each bay and headland another piece fitted into the grand design. To Banks, it was a blooming book whose pages turned with every landfall. To the sailors, it was both cradle and cage, holding them gently in calm, tossing them violently in storm, always reminding them of their smallness against its expanse. There is a quiet lesson in this, that the vastness of life can be recorded in many ways. Some write lines and numbers, some sketch petals, some tell stories by lantern light. All are ways of reflecting, of preserving the immensity without needing to contain it. The Pacific was too great to be captured fully, yet each journal entry, each pressed leaf, each whispered tale was a fragment of truth, a ripple of understanding upon its surface. Cook once described the ocean as if it were a diary written in waves, its pages turning endlessly, each tide carrying a new line, each storm erasing and rewriting the words before. His role, he felt, was to copy those pages as faithfully as possible, to preserve what could be preserved, to pass on what could not be held in memory alone. And though his words were steady, one can imagine that in quiet moments he recognised how partial such reflections must be, how much of the ocean would remain always unwritten. Imagine now the captain seated by lantern glow, his quill scratching softly, his face lined with concentration. Around him, sailors sleep in hammocks, their breathing a counterpoint to the ocean's murmur outside. Banks sits nearby, sketching a shell or a flower found that morning, his hand moving quickly, his eyes bright with delight. Tupaia perhaps gazes upward, his thoughts tracing the invisible routes between stars, maps not bound to paper but carried within. Each in his own way reflects, each in his own way records, and together they weave a tapestry of memory as wide and varied as the sea itself. For you, listening tonight, this act of reflection can also be a gentle reminder. Your own. Life may feel vast, filled with distances too wide to comprehend, but like Cook, you can write a line. Like Banks, you can notice a blossom. Like the sailors, you can tell a story to a companion. No reflection need capture everything. It is enough to hold a fragment, to preserve a moment, to let the immensity pass through you without fear. So the Endeavour sailed on, her journals filling with maps and sketches, her crew carrying stories in their voices, her captain steady in his duty. Behind them stretched thousands of miles of ocean already crossed, ahead of them thousands more, but in their hands and minds they carried reflections that transformed endless sea into memory. The Pacific remained vast, but within it lived countless details, waves like sentences, stars like lanterns, islands like chapters, each one recorded, each one remembered, and as you rest now, you too can let the ocean become your diary. Each breath is a line, each sigh a tide, each dream a wave carrying you forward. You do not need to record it all. It is enough to drift with the rhythm, to let the immensity surround you, to trust that memory, like the sea, will hold what matters. The voyage continues, but tonight it does so softly, in reflection, in stillness, in the slow turning of pages written in waves. There are nights at sea when the world seems to fold into simplicity, when nothing remains but the ship, the water, and the sky. For the men of the Endeavour, the Pacific night was both familiar and endlessly new, a vast canvas of stars above and a black expanse below, stitched together by the quiet rocking of the ship. After the duties of the day, after charts had been drawn and hammocks slung, after dice had been rattled and songs sung, the evening settled into silence, broken only by the sigh of waves against the hull. It was in these hours that reflection deepened, that men stood at the rail with eyes lifted upward, and felt both smaller and more connected than they had ever felt before. The stars came first as faint glimmers against the violet dusk, then sharpened as night grew deeper, until they burned with a brilliance unknown to those who lived under city smoke. Constellations shifted here in the southern skies, some familiar, others strange, and sailors who had once relied on the North Star now learned to trust other guides. The Milky Way stretched broad and luminous, a river of light flowing overhead, mirrored faintly in the dark swells below. The air was cool and still, carrying the salt of the ocean, the faint resin of ropes, the smoke of lanterns. The creak of timbers was steady, like the slow breathing of the ship herself, a rhythm that lulled even wakeful minds into calm. Some men lay upon the deck, hands folded behind their heads, gazing upward as if watching the slow turning of a wheel far beyond their reach. Others leaned against the rail, eyes fixed upon the line where sky touched water, wondering whether they gazed at infinity or simply at the edge of their own sight. For a time, silence held, the vastness of night too great to interrupt with chatter. Then, softly, a voice would begin, perhaps humming a tune, perhaps reciting a fragment of prayer, perhaps whispering a story from home. Another voice joined, then another, until the night was filled not with noise but with gentle sound, a chorus woven of memory, faith, and longing. Tupaia sometimes spoke in these hours, his voice low, his hand pointing upward. He named stars in the language of his people, weaving them into pathways and stories. He spoke of routes traced by ancestors, voyages made without compass or sextant, journeys guided only by eyes and memory, by the rise and fall of swells, by the colour of the sky before dawn. The sailors listened with reverence, for though they did not always understand his words, they felt the weight of his knowledge, the way his gaze turned the night into a map, the sea into a road, the stars into lanterns hung above for all who travelled. To them it was as though he carried a library not in books but in his mind, each constellation a chapter, each horizon a page. Cook, quiet in his own way, often stood apart, his quill put away for the night, his eyes lifted like the rest. He was not a man of myth, yet even he must have felt the pull of the heavens, the strange comfort of knowing that across the world others gazed upon these same lights. His reflections were practical, his words neat, but his silences carried another meaning, that awe, like duty, could guide a voyage. Banks too sat quietly at times, his notebook closed, his sketches forgotten, his hands resting as he looked upward, his mind filled not with classification but with wonder. Even the most restless sailor, the most sceptical or weary, found himself softened beneath that infinite spread of light. Imagine yourself now lying upon that deck. The wood is cool beneath your back. The ship sways gently, rocking you as though in a cradle. Above you, stars scatter themselves across the sky, some clustered, some alone, all distant yet steady. You hear the soft murmur of waves, the occasional snap of a rope, the sigh of canvas shifting. Around you, men breathe deeply, some whispering, some silent, all bound together by the shared act of looking upward. The night is vast, but you do not feel lost within it. Instead, you feel held, connected, as though every star is a thread, and every thread ties you not only to the ship, but to every person who has ever looked upon the night sky. In that thought lies a quiet unity. For though Cook and his men were far from home, though the Pacific seemed endless, they knew that somewhere across the water their families looked at the same stars. The Polynesians too, with chants and stories, look upward at these lights and trace their histories across them. And you, lying now in your own quiet, look upward at the same constellations, distant yet shared, eternal in their patience. The stars remind us that though our seas may differ, we sail beneath the same sky, carried by the same tides of time. The sailors sometimes whispered of this unity in their own way. One said that stars were like lanterns hung by God to guide all men home. Another joked that they were holes poked in the sky so that the light of heaven could shine through. A third simply sighed, saying nothing, for he felt that no words were needed. Each found meaning as he could, and each found comfort, for the stars asked nothing but attention, and gave in return a sense of belonging. So the Pacific night became not a void, but a gathering place. The ship, small though it was, floated within a cathedral of silence and light. The men rested in hammocks, rocked gently by the ocean's rhythm, their dreams softened by the knowledge that the world, though vast, was not divided. The sky above stretched unbroken, the water below reflected it, and between the two drifted a single vessel filled with men who, for all their differences, were united in their gaze. For you tonight, the Pacific night can be the same. Close your eyes and feel the deck beneath you, the sway of the ship, the breath of the ocean. Picture the stars above, countless and calm, shining not only for explorers centuries past, but for you now. Let their steadiness quiet your thoughts. Let their patience slow your breath. Let their unity remind you that you too are part of this vastness. The ship will carry you, the sea will rock you, and the night will hold you, until dreams arrive as gently as the dawn. There comes a time on every voyage when the horizon no longer calls with urgency, when the sails are no longer swollen with the tension of discovery, but instead hang easy in a steady breeze, carrying the ship toward rest. For the Endeavour and her company, that time arrived not in a single moment, but in a slow unfurling. As nights grew quieter, journals filled with their final lines, and even the most restless sailors softened into a rhythm of reflection rather than anticipation. The Pacific, vast and untiring, continued to roll beneath them, but now it felt less like a challenge and more like a companion, steady and familiar, rocking the ship as though cradling it toward the end of a long journey. Cook, ever faithful to his duty, still wrote at his table, the lantern casting a small circle of light across his pages. Yet there was a difference in his lines. The earlier pages had brimmed with bearings, careful sketches of coasts, calculations of distance and depth, all precise and urgent. Now the words carried a quieter tone. His maps were largely complete, his charts filled, and though the sea always offered more to be known, he allowed himself the luxury of summing rather than seeking. His journal closed each night with less of the relentless calculation, and more of a simple reflection. The ocean vast, the men weary, the voyage long, the task nearly fulfilled. He dipped his quill, let it glide across the page, and then finally set it down, folding his hands as though at prayer, the journal resting like a closed door at the end of a long hallway. Banks, too, who had sketched furiously and pressed thousands of specimens, began to slow his collecting. His notebooks were thick, filled with drawings of birds and plants, his chests heavy with dried leaves and shells. In the evenings he flipped through the pages, smiling faintly at the memories each one carried. A flower pressed between sheets reminding him of Tahiti's gardens, a feather recalling New Zealand's cries, a shell evoking the strange sounds of Australia. He knew he had captured a fraction of the Pacific's abundance, yet that fraction was enough to fill a lifetime of study. He began to put away his instruments earlier, to linger by the rail instead, to watch the stars without sketching them, to listen to sailors' songs without feeling the need to write them down. His reflections became less about discovery and more about gratitude. The sailors whose laughter had once been filled with the sharp edge of relief or the brashness of youth now laughed more softly, their stories retold with gentler tones. Dice still clattered, songs still rose, but there was less urgency, less desperation in the way they grasped at amusement. They had survived storms, endured monotony, eaten their fill of salted pork and breadfruit alike, and now they felt the weariness of men who'd done much and asked little more. Hammocks swayed more quietly, dice games ended sooner, shanties softened into murmurs. The men who had once longed fiercely for land now seemed content to let the ship carry them a little longer, for they had come to understand that the journey itself was as much home as any shore. Tupaia, who had guided them with his voice and his memory, now sat more often in silence. His eyes still lifted to the stars, but his words grew fewer. Perhaps he too was reflecting, not only on the voyage they had shared, but on the larger journey of his people, who had sailed these waters for centuries without need of European charts. His presence remained a quiet reminder that the Pacific had always been mapped, always been known, long before the Endeavour traced its lines upon parchment. He did not need to speak often. His silence carried its own weight, his stillness its own wisdom. The ship itself seemed to rest. Lanterns swayed softly, their flames dimmer now, as though echoing the winding down of human energy aboard. The creak of timbers was no longer harsh but gentle, the sound of wood settling into calm. The sails, patched and weathered, no longer strained against violent gusts but fluttered easily in steady winds. The ocean rocked the hull in long, slow swells, and even the waves seemed subdued, their murmur a lullaby rather than a roar. Imagine yourself walking the deck in those final evenings. The air is cool, the stars above steady, the lanterns glowing like small moons. Cook sits at his table, closing his journal with deliberate care. Banks leans against the rail, his notebook tucked away, his gaze turned outward rather than downward. Sailors murmur in hammocks, their laughter faint, their breathing deep. Tupaia gazes upward, his silence as eloquent as speech. The ship is no longer in haste, no longer straining forward, but simply moving, calmly, steadily, as though guided now not by duty but by rest itself. For you, this scene can be the doorway into your own quiet harbour. The lanterns dim, the journals close, the laughter softens, the stars remain steady. The voyage does not end abruptly. It slows, fades, quiets, just as your thoughts can fade now into dreams. The Pacific has been immense, the journey long, but in the end it is peace that remains. Peace in the rocking of the sea, peace in the closing of a book, peace in the silence that comes after song. And so, the Endeavour drifted on into the night, her crew at rest, her lanterns dimmed, her story written in waves and journals alike. Cook slept, his quill dry, his charts stacked neatly. Banks slept, his sketches safe in chests. The sailors slept, their hammocks swaying in time with the tide. The Pacific itself seemed to sleep, its surface smooth, its stars patient, its breath slow. And now our voyage too comes to its quiet shore. We have followed Cook and his crew across oceans, through storms and gardens, across myths and maps, until at last we arrive here, where the sea is calm and the night is deep. You may let go of the journey now, for it will carry on without you, just as the ship carried its crew through sleep. Close your eyes, feel the rocking of the sea within your breath, and allow yourself to drift. That's where tonight's exploration rests, in waves softening, in lanterns fading, in silence like a harbour. Thank you for joining me. If you'd like to drift again, subscribe or share this calm passage. Sleep peacefully wherever you are.